is really the difference between those two paths in terms of going forward, as apolitically as you can speak to this for me, Raheem, of a Trump presidency for the next 4 years or a Biden presidency returning to those policies? What does that look like? Lay it out for our viewers.
As well, those congressmen and the senators, and actually the ordinary people all around the country who are speaking up, and the Chinese whistleblowers who are speaking up. You know, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't play around. They are making themselves targets every time they speak up, every time they report something, every time you click retweet or something like that. You are standing up to the Chinese Communist Party, and they don't play around. So it's going to take courage, and it's going to take being brave. And it's going to take sacrifice sometimes as well. You know, maybe you're going to have to pay an extra $100 for the latest iPhone. You know, if we repatriate manufacturing into the United States. But the juxtaposition is even more stark at this election than it was in 2016. Now, 2016 was 1 year after the major migrant crisis that happened in Europe. And I said at the time, if you thought Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, was bad on mass migration, you wait and see what happens if Hillary Clinton becomes the president. It would have made the migrant crisis look like a drop in the ocean in comparison with what she would have done. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, all these things we managed to avoid. And then rolling back of NAFTA and having the new USMCA deal, all of these great things that have happened to this country. Imagine all of that being unrolled under a Biden presidency. And then further, Joe Biden and his team, Max Baucus, by the way, the last Obama administration's ambassador to China, saying himself that Joe Biden wouldn't be as critical of the Chinese Communist Party as President Trump is. Why? Because he would want to sell the country like the Obama administration, by the way, like Republican administrations have done in the past, sell them to the Chinese Communist Party. So this election, and by the way, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm a British citizen. So I'm sitting here and taking the view of this and saying, hey, I prefer economic nationalism, and that's why I prefer Donald Trump. But actually, from a non-partisan perspective on this, it's extraordinary to watch people even flirting with the idea of voting for Joe Biden. A vote for Joe Biden is a vote for Beijing.
And that's even putting the things that we know about regarding his son, Hunter, aside, right? It's a policy question. If you pretend like we don't know what we know about what Hunter Biden has done, and the proof that really does seem to be coming more and more true every single day. And I think we'll see more of that to come. Putting all of that aside, a policy question stated from Joe Biden's own lips is a very distinct change, a direct L, right? A veer off, of course, from what Donald Trump has done to put us on a different course with the CCP, which will mean differences in the daily lives of Americans. How, Raheem?
Well, firstly, look at this pandemic, right? Look at how we got to this situation where the Chinese Communist Party took the steps of not wanting to communicate to the world that it had a major pandemic, a communicable human-to-human transmission disease on its hand. Even when the Taiwanese tried to put the flag up and say to the World Health Organization, hey, you know, we have this situation going on here. You know, think about that as a microcosm of what could happen if Joe Biden was president of the United States. You think Joe Biden would have shut off travel from China, from mainland China to the United States? Absolutely not. He criticized it at the time.
Democrats ridiculed our president for shutting off travel to China.
Called him a racist?
Called him a
racist for stopping travel from somewhere where there was a major new communicable virus, right? That was on planes coming to the United States. Right. But they didn't call anybody racist when Europe banned Americans from traveling to Europe. And they give the game away like this. But the pandemic is a microcosm to see how Biden would affect the ordinary day-to-day lives of Americans if he were president, and selling us out further to the Chinese Communist Party. And I say us because it doesn't just affect Americans. It affects the entire Western world, the entire Western civilization, whether it's the United Kingdom, France, Germany, all across Europe, Latin America. Every single nation has suffered. You know, you say CCP lied, Americans died. Yeah, British died, French died, Italians died, Spanish died. You go through the list of the free nations of the world that are suffering at the yoke of the CCP. It's very clear and you take what's going on in Africa with the neo-colonialism that the CCP is doing in Africa, the abuse of the Uyghur minorities in mainland China. I mean, I've heard non-stop for decades from the political left that we have a moral obligation to help when there are human rights crises going on around the world, but complete silence when Muslim minorities in China are being loaded up on trains and blindfolded. Complete silence. Do you want to know what Joe Biden presidency looks like? It's all of those things and worse.
And it seems so ironic to me so often, Raheem, that it's the very people, the press, for example, so often defending the CCP and seeming to be on their side when they would be the first to probably be shut down completely, right? If China...
You think about the way that China has treated journalists and Western journalists in China, and these people are still carrying water for them. I mean, I want to know what you think, Gina, on this stuff as well, because you've worked across the media sphere over your career, and you've worked with these mainstream and left-wing journalists, all these outlets. What is going on in their heads that they don't think it's necessary to critique the Chinese Communist Party?
I mean, in my opinion, Raheem, it's just so much easier to go along with groupthink. And I think it's the danger. I think we've seen it. When I was a little girl, I remember reading, Orwell and all the things that we all have to read when we're in school. At least we used to have to read when we were in school. I don't think anyone has to read those things anymore. My kids do. I remember reading of course, about the Holocaust and finding out that I have Jewish ancestry, and then reading it even more and studying it even more and thinking, how could that really happen in a free America? And almost having a disbelief that could ever happen here. And now I believe it could. And it's because I think that it's just the pressure to not stand up is so, and we've even seen it just with the COVID thing. I think we've seen good constitutional conservatives, or just, you don't even need to say the word conservative. It doesn't even have to be political. Just people that I thought understood our constitutional law, cower to groupthink that is completely unproven, completely unnecessary, completely unconstitutional, and we've seen them cower over and over and over. And I think if it's that easy for people that I really thought understood the rule of law, very simply, what does it mean when it really hits home? When they're holding a gun to your family member's head? Because in actuality, some of the people that we have on this agenda today, I can tell you, I know personally from speaking to them, their family members have been threatened. They personally have been threatened. Their children have been threatened. We're used to this in media. We get our threats. But when you are a congressperson who stands up on this issue, on China, I can tell you that those kind of threats are a dime a dozen to you. Like, you get them every single day. And it takes a special kind of courage. So when you are talking about the retweets, these congressmen, I like to give action items to our viewers. These congressmen that are here speaking on this issue today, what you can do as an audience member is give them backup. You can go retweet them when they tweet on the CCP. You can retweet Raheem's show. You can repost his stuff. You can tune in to us. You can. These are the things you can do from your home to give backup to what we're presenting today, because the media outlets that will present this stuff to you, they're the ones that are going to be the targets of the next smear campaign, of the next threat. And the congressmen who are here today, who are standing on the issue of the CCP, they're the ones whose families, whose wives, whose children are taking the threats that are incoming. And I can promise you that. And it's only going to get worse. And I can assure you of that too. Because now they've tasted a little blood in the water. They've seen what they can do with this virus. They've seen how quickly Americans will relinquish some of their constitutional rights. It's been astonishing to me. And I think now that they've seen that, their experiment is not dead.
Well, they've seen what young Americans are doing in terms of installing Chinese Communist Party software on their phones in the form of TikTok,
yes,
and other apps like this. They've seen how quickly we're willing to give up our constitutional rights. They've seen how quickly the Democrat Party of America, along with the media, is willing to repeat the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda lines. Remember, suddenly the disease just disappeared in mainland China, and they just said, "Oh, we're free and clear of it now." I mean, that's a total lie. It's a complete lie, and we know that because they had several lockdowns months after they had said that, so it didn't disappear, and they had it. But now the media says every single day, America has the top number of cases in the world. It's not true.
It's not true.
It's not true, and it's not proven either. And you go through line by line by line on this, and you start to follow the money, right? This is one of the most important things a real journalist can do, is follow the money.
Yes.
Look at the Harvard Ash Center. The Harvard Ash Center recently came out with a study that said 93% of Chinese people approve of the Chinese Communist Party. So, of course, being the journalists that we actually are, we went through this report to try and look for the crosstabs, the data. And there's one line in this Harvard Ash Center study that just says, we worked with a reputable Chinese polling firm on this. That was it. Didn't name the firm, didn't give any of the data over, which is usual for a polling company. You can go to their website and go through the data. This is Harvard we're talking about here. You look at the Confucius Institutes all around the United States. You look at the integration of Chinese technology in American technology companies. And you also look at the big tech companies, right? The Googles, the Microsofts, the Twitters. They've all got people who have either been CCP linked or are currently CCP linked on their boards. We want to talk about how we start fighting the war. You've got to start sanctioning these people and saying, actually, we don't want a stated enemy of the United States on American corporate boards. That can't happen anymore.
Would you let a child of yours have TikTok on their phone?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Yeah, it's astonishing. Last night we went to dinner to a place we've gone many times here in Washington, D.C., and they had a Black Lives Matter sign in the window. First time I'd noticed it, according to some of the folks I was at dinner with, they said they've had that sign. You've been there before. I didn't notice it before. They also have a bashed-in window from the Black Lives Matter, which I need to always say, it's not about Black lives. It's about a communist front group who has determined to destroy the Western family as we know it and our country as we know it. And so I said, I'm not going to eat here anymore. But what do we do? Because, the manager had explained to one of our party, this is something that we do as self-preservation, because otherwise they're going to destroy our business. And we're one of the only restaurants open in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is a graveyard right now, and for all intents and purposes. Most restaurants aren't open, especially on the weekends, which is just completely strange. So how do citizens know where to draw these lines?
Well, one of the good things about this whole situation in Washington, D.C. and the lockdown is I've actually learned to cook. So you're welcome over at my house whenever you want.
We're going to be over every night at Raheem's house for dinner.
I've learned to reverse sear a steak and just to perfection. So you're always welcome.
Thank you.
But that's absolutely right, is that D.C. is still a graveyard. It's Dust Bowl now here. It's absolutely nothing going on. And the places that you can still go to either have LGBT flags or BLM signs or whatever it is. And ordinary people and conservatives out there just want to go somewhere to eat without politics infecting absolutely everything to do with their day-to-day lives. They don't want to give money over to an organization or a business that supports an overt Marxist entity.
That's it.
These aren't our words. These are the words of Black Lives Matter organizers themselves, who have said, hey, yes, we are trained Marxists. So why would I want to go anywhere with my wallet that puts up BLM signs when we know that what we're doing is therefore endorsing and funding an organization that wants to turn over?
More than $1 billion, not to interrupt you, more than $1 billion has already gone to Black Lives Matter, which is, as Raheem explained, it is a bona fide Marxist group.
But where's the money going? That's the question. Where's the money? Where's that $1 billion going? Because the last I checked, when they're doing these BLM signs on the roads outside Trump International in New York, or whether it's here at what's now called Black Lives Matter Plaza, which is actually was one of the best places in DC to go, was that little junction where you had the Off the Record and the Hay Adams, the University Club, and the Bombay Club, and all these great DC institutions that people would gather at and go to and dine at and meet with each other. Those are all gone now because you've got these big Black Lives Matter signs on the floor and the places are just inundated with people every day. But it's actually the state and therefore the taxpayer that's picking up the bill for those things. So where is this billion going from the Black Lives Matter donations? We know it goes to Act Blue, which is the Democrat Party's fundraising website. But where is it going from there? I would be very, very surprised if it wasn't going directly into political campaigns, candidates themselves.
And we've seen this for years, this funneling of money, through front groups. It's the reason my husband was actually kicked out of California, because he was cleaning that up. And the Governor Brown, wrote 2 bills to make it so my husband could no longer expel the waste, fraud, and abuse in California. But we've seen it all over the country. We've seen it through Planned Parenthood, to the tune of, our taxpayer dollars, to the tune of more than $1 million per day, going directly into Democrat coffers for the purposes of politics. And so if you don't believe there's a difference, it really isn't about political leanings anymore. It's about Marxism, communism versus capitalism. And it really comes down to that in very real ways that it never really did even 10 years ago. I mean, the party of Kennedy, the party of Clinton, gone, really.
I'm so glad
Clinton,
you mentioned Orwell, by the way, because Orwell is one of the critical people that needs to be read again right now. And not just 1984, and not just Animal Farm, but The Road to Wigan Pier, and so many of his essays. Notes on Nationalism is such an important essay by George Orwell, because if you think the left criticizes nationalism all the time, and the media criticizes nationalism all the time, but they understand nationalism as a philosophical concept, because George Orwell did. And what he did was he told people to warn people against petty nationalism. And petty nationalism is where you take a group of people, whether it's African Americans in this country, and you lump them all under one, and you say Black Lives Matter, and you kind of hive them off away from the rest of the country. The warnings against petty nationalism for George Orwell were so prescient that they bear reading again and again and again. And this is not a plug, but I have been actually watching a lecture series on the Great Courses. I don't know if you know what that is, his website.
Yes.
And I've been watching a lecture series on Orwell while all of this has been going on. And it's just incredible how much warning we've been given time and time again for all of these things. And it's just so sad. Like you say, they took these stuff out of schools, right? They took it out of schools, so the kids have no idea what to watch out for in their lives, what totalitarianism really looks like.
Right.
They just hear Don Lemon on TV comparing the president to Adolf Hitler, and they go, yeah, okay, that sounds about right to me. And it's a disgrace.
Well, any of the writings, I think, are so important. I tell my children, study any of the writings that led up to totalitarian governments, whether it's Bonhoeffer, Solzhenitsyn, any of those, because what is happening in our world right now has happened over and over again. And there were patriots who understood that warning at those times. And so if you read the writings of the people that understood what was happening, there's nothing new under the sun here. People have seen this before, and they wrote the warnings. And so you just have to go back and read those things. And there's a roadmap to get out of this. Will we?
That's the question I think that bears heaviest on me, and it's probably the first question that pops into my head every morning when I wake up, and it's in my head every night before I go to sleep, is, are people going to realize in time? Because actually, if you look over the course of human history, very few peoples have realized in time. Yeah. They have actually had to suffer under the yoke of socialism, of communism, to have these people running the streets. There's a reason that they say, whose streets are streets, during their protests. It's an openly seditious movement of people who don't believe in the Constitution of the United States, who don't believe in Western traditional values, who don't believe in the family unit. I mean, you go through, there's a litany of things that they confess themselves that they want to see overthrown. They just so happen to be everything that the West is built on. And you go through all these things and you think to yourself, actually, all I hear from young people nowadays is critiques of all of those things that have built the Western world. And look, let me tell a personal story. My name is Raheem Kassam, right? I'm not of the New Hampshire Kassams. My parents came from India via Tanzania to the United Kingdom. And they immigrated with the express purpose of giving us, their kids, my brother and I, a better life. And they expected us to comport ourselves in ways that lent to that. So for me, as somebody who's a first generation, second generation person, depending on how you look at it, coming to the West and coming to the United States and seeing you giving up all that freedom, seeing you just willfully handing over your data, your personages to the Chinese Communist Party and to Marxism and to this failed ideology, this totalitarian ideology, it breaks my heart,
Yeah. I mean, I think of all of the people that fought and died, not just for this country, but for freedom throughout the ages, to see us, so freely relinquishing so many of our freedoms. I think of, people in nursing homes right now dying alone. That thought gets me out of bed in the morning every day right now, during this to fight on. And I know that there are so many motivating factors for so many of us, but I also think there is something so amazing about the American experiment that is so unique and so individual and so amazing that I do have hope, and I hope you have hope too. And one of the most hopeful people that I know Dean Dave Bratt from Liberty University. He is going to officially open the Falkirk Freedom Summit, and we're going to go to him now, and you're going to enjoy this amazing program. Dean Dave Bratt.
Ready, guys?
And so we're back here for just a moment. Seems we're having some technical difficulty transferring over to Dean Bratt, but we're going to get back to him in just a moment. But in the meantime, Raheem, so you looked through the program. Which of the different programs? We know what the War Room is going on, and that's super exciting. Of course, everybody loves the War Room.
My favorite one is the War Room pandemic.
Well, it is amazing. It is our highest rated show. Everybody loves that show. The president himself compliments that show. I was with him last week, and we discussed again how much he loves your show.
Oh, well, that's very, very kind. I've got to say that Dave Bratt, actually, Dean Bratt, is a personal hero of mine. Not just because he manages to pull things like this together. We all know his incredible election accomplishments over his past as well. But Dave is just the most upbeat guy all the time.
That's what I was going to say when you and I were like giving our doom and gloom. Like somehow Dave Bratt, you know what he honestly said to me? This is actually funny. You guys are going to love this little inside baseball here. So, you know, I'm moderating this panel on China, basically, and communism. And he said, make it fun. I'm like, make it fun? Because China and communism are such a fun topic. But that's Dave. Like, he's just so every guy. And he's just such an optimist. Yes.
Yeah, and pulling this event together, I thought he would be so stressed and have the world on his shoulders. And he just calls me up a few days ago. You know, he had somebody drop out somewhere along the schedule moderating, and he just calls me and says, hey, buddy, just want to get a quick message here. If you could be on standby to moderate something at some point, that would be great. And I'm like, how are you so chipper? Like, it's extraordinary, but sometimes that's what it takes, right? It takes optimism. It takes stick-to-itiveness. It takes courage, most of all. But it's so great to have somebody like Dave Bratt hosting today, because I think he inspires the audience. He certainly inspires me. And you can while we get the audio back for the viewers at home, we can hear the audio from the hall right now.
Yeah.
And we can hear how upbeat it is.
Yeah, it is. I mean, somehow Dave Bratt finds a way to be very inspired. And so we're going to try going out there again. Without any further ado, Dean Dave Bratt from Liberty University.
Has always emphasized action, action. And we have 4 tremendous speeches coming out of the Attorney General, Vice President Pence, Secretary of State Pompeo, Steve Bannon on the War Room has outlined all those talks. But I wanted to get Steve's perspective on, it's remarkable to me, CNN, the left media, is not covering China. And you know more about the media and business than anyone. Why is that?
I think it's twofold. One, I think it goes against their narrative. And two, I think the mainstream media has been one of the central aspects of this managed decline of the entire Judaeo Christian West, but particularly the United States. I think that they've done a terrible job. This story has been in people's faces for so long. And let me give you a very specific aspect of it. On the 3rd week of January of 2017, speech is given. Was in Davos at the World Economic Forum. That was General Secretary Xi of the Chinese Communist Party. He gave a speech. A couple of days later was followed by the inaugural address of Donald J. Trump as the United States. Xi, at this conference, and this is all the top hedge fund, founders, top advisors, banks, investment banks, law firms, marketing firms, communication, all of the mainstream media, and talked about the biggest problem in the world was rising populism and economic nationalism, and that globalization was the future, had done so well. Remember, at the time he gave that speech, because these are people, whatever aspect, whether it's investment, law, they're all in the information business. This is the 21st century's dominant industry, the information business. They knew at that time the concentration camps of the Uyghurs. They knew about the house Christians being persecuted. They knew about the suppression of the Catholic Church. They knew about every aspect, organ harvesting, the Falun Gong, the Tiananmen Square movement, all of the suppression. They knew about all of it, and it didn't matter. They held up. The Economist had him on the cover. The Financial Times, huge story. Donald Trump, 3 days later, gives what is known as the American Carnage speech, but what the key of the speech was, he goes through a litany of the elite done.
Yep.
According to the American Carnage, says, now comes the hour of action.
Right.
Okay? He was a disruptor to that system. Trump was a defense of the Westphalian system, a nation state,
right,
and how sovereign and a collection of an alliance of liberty around the world of sovereign nations. This. And of course, the mainstream media is saying what a visionary she is, what a moment she is. He understands globalization, and you see this Trump is this, from the deplorables, etc. So the mainstream media has been inextricably linked, and here's the reason. And it's the reason all of American finance and American corporations and global corporations is part of the business model. They're in business. They're business partners. When Pompeo the other day at the Nixon,
Welcome back to Freedom Summit 2020.
I'm looking forward to the Tom Cotton talk.
I think I see a senator ready to come on out. Senator, if you're ready, come on out. We're getting them mic'd up.
Okay, great.
Let me continue.
I came here for the Tom Cotton talk.
Oh, I know. Same here. We're all looking forward. How are we doing? Oh, good. We're going to do a sizzle reel.
Oh,
good. We're all ready. Good. Good. Awesome. He's mic'd. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our kickoff session for the panels this afternoon. We can't wait for you. Please go out to the Falkirk Center on Facebook for the agenda to see what's coming. It's my pleasure right now to introduce you to one of my personal friends and heroes in the U.S. Senate. Used to serve in the House, He served our country in the military for years. He's got an intellect, Harvard Law. But most important, the great figures that emerge in history and that rise to leadership positions have a strong, firm moral backbone and center. And that is the key to the man I'm about ready to interview, Senator Tom Cotton. Welcome to the Falkirk Center. It's an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you, Dave. It's good to be here. I apologize for running a few minutes late. The streets are shut down out there for our old colleague John Lewis's funeral procession.
Yep. No, we explained to the folks, and
thank you all for being patient.
We're excited to have you. Well, we just had the Steve Bannon did the War Room Pandemic show prior, and one of the centerpieces of this event is trying to get leaders' positions. This is kind of an action conference on how do you phrase how the virus from China made its way here? Was there active intent? Was it an accident? You have more information than we do, and so where are you at on that these days?
China unleashed this plague on the world. It was a combination of negligence, which is typical of the Chinese Communist Party, and malevolence, which is also typical.
Yep.
So the negligence comes from the very earliest days of not aggressively seeking out the cause of the outbreak of an unknown pneumonia in Wuhan from early December, when local authorities knew it, not listening to the local authorities, having created a system that discouraged local authorities to be honest. Then the malevolence started when they actively began to suppress the reporting. They visited some of the doctors who were blowing the whistle on this virus in the middle of the night and told them to knock it off. Tragically, one of them, Li Wenlong, ended up contracting the virus and was one of the first persons killed by it, leaving behind a wife and a child, and an unborn child as well. And then, of course, they refused to come clean early.
Yep.
The World Health Organization, they refused, as they continue to do, to allow international scientists and medical experts into Wuhan. They began to intimidate Taiwan and the World Health Organization from sharing some of Taiwan's early lessons, since Taiwan has probably handled this virus better than any other land in the world. And then they continued to lie about the severity of it. They even allowed air travel to continue out from China to the rest of the world, which had the effect of seeding cases in places like Italy or places like New York that, of course, ultimately unleashed the pandemic on the world. So, in my opinion, there's no doubt that the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for turning what could have been a bad local health challenge into the worst pandemic in the last century.
Yeah, thank you. And you have been out in front on China before the pandemic. You've been following China in terms of U.S. strategic interests for years. But there has been a little reluctance from the political leadership up here on both sides of the aisle to want to engage. Just on simple inspection, it just seems to me, if you say the premise is either through negligence or through intent, China did send it, right? They shut down the airports in Wuhan. They shut down the airports going to Beijing. But they allowed 400,000 flights out to Milan and New York and San Francisco. So there's some level of intent, period. And then all the unpleasantness, 40 million Americans dislocated from their jobs, family breakups, depression, kids out of school, small business shutdowns, bankruptcies. All of that, it seems, flows logically from the virus. A half a year ago, we were all watching football and kids were going to school. And so how do you, and it goes beyond just the U.S., it's global damage. How do you state and assess the total damage done? And then how are we going to hold China accountable for that damage?
Well, it does all go back to the Chinese Communist Party. And anyone affected by this virus, which is pretty much everyone, whether they've lost loved ones, they've had loved ones fall ill, whether they've been ill themselves, lost a job, had their business closed, had their savings damaged, their schools have been closed. There's really no one in our country, maybe no one around the world at this point, that has not suffered because the Chinese Communist Party was so deeply indifferent to human life. Not just our lives, but their own citizens' lives, since the Chinese people are the first and worst victims of Chinese communism. Some people say it's too cynical to suggest that Xi Jinping and the leaders of the Communist Party would intentionally inflict this virus on the world. I would respond that the modern Chinese Communist Party has killed 65 million of their own people. So if you don't think that they would sacrifice a few hundred lives of foreigners to maintain their relative power in the world, to ensure that they were not the only one who suffered a virus-induced recession, then you are being very naive. And they should be held accountable for it. There's some ways to hold them directly accountable. I've introduced legislation, and the administration has taken similar action to sanction officials who lied about this virus or who do so in the future. I've introduced legislation with a few of my colleagues that would amend the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act to allow Americans to sue Chinese officials who are responsible for inflicting this harm on them. There may be a couple exceptions to the general doctrine of sovereign immunity under the current law, but why beat around the bush? Let's just say clearly that what we did for the 9/11 victims, we should do for the victims of this virus as well. Those are a couple ways you could make the Chinese Communist Party pay directly. But there's a whole host of things we could do to make them pay indirectly, things that we probably should have done a long time ago. But this virus has really opened the eyes of so many Americans to the need to do those things. So for instance, over the last 30 years, but especially over the last 20 years, since Congress inadvisedly gave China permanent most favored nation status and then admitted China into the World Trade Organization, we have lost millions and millions of manufacturing jobs. And some of those jobs are in critical industries. I'm not talking about children's toys or cheap plastic lawn furniture. I'm talking about the things we've learned: medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, high-tech, telecom. We have to get the manufacturing out of China for those critical goods. I think most Americans were shocked when they learned earlier this year how dependent we are upon China for life-saving items. So I've introduced legislation that would provide the incentives necessary to get manufacturing jobs back in the United States, whether it's accelerated tax subsidies or direct support through states for things like the semiconductor industry, or providing an assured source of demand, say for pharmaceuticals. The Department of Defense, the VA, Medicare, and Medicaid, they buy a lot of drugs. And if you say they have to buy a certain of those that are made in the USA, and then you say they can't buy any that are made in China, that means that we're going to have both the domestic manufacturing capacity that we need, and we're only going to trade in those critical goods with our partners, countries like Japan or Denmark or Austria that are already sources for those kind of imports. There's other things that we can do as well. We need to continue the rebuild of our military that the president launched 3 years ago to deter China from ever thinking they should take a shot at the United States or our allies and partners in the Western Pacific. We need to crack down on what's happening on our college campuses, where China has seeded campuses with Confucius Institutes, which are little more than propaganda outfits at best, or espionage centers at worst. We also need to crack down on the practice of supporting American researchers covertly on college campuses, often as a way to get them obliged to support the Chinese Communist Party through their research in things like the 1,000 Talents program and other recruitment programs. It's kind of a scandal that that's not illegal itself. People who get charged with these crimes are charged with failure to disclose it because they also get Department of Defense or Department of Energy grants, like the head of the chemistry department at Harvard, or we had an engineering professor in Arkansas a couple months ago that faced these charges. We should make the actual practice of being funded by the Chinese Communist Party or its affiliated or supported entities illegal itself. Again, those aren't direct ways to make them pay for the virus, but they're so integral to the Chinese Communist Party's grip on power and the way that they have built their economy to compete with ours and to take our jobs, that they will feel that pain severely.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. I've got a few questions I want to drill. You just brought up higher ed, so I'm at Liberty University. This is the Falkirk Center, President Jerry Falwell and Charlie Kirk, vision for it, and we're dedicated to faith and freedom. And so those are the biggest, obviously no Confucius aspects here. But, you spent time at Harvard, and for me, it's amazing how the elites have just I know the answer is going to be money, right? Just to give you, we know. But how have they chosen to bypass all economic logic? What MBA school said you put all of your supply chains in one, right? The first thing you learn in finance class is diversify. How in the world did we ever get to this point? How in the world have we just ignored the monopolies that have arisen in the information space that can be abused by China, right? Facebook and Google and all these, right? And the Twitter and all this. So first of all, how in the world is it just a matter of self-interest and our firms have been watching the short-term economics?
I think going back 30 years to the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, we made the mistake of largely overlooking that massacre. There were some modest steps taken, but I think that was a moment as the Soviet Union was crumbling that the Chinese Communist Party showed its true faith. And it is still a communist country. Maybe Xi Jinping doesn't sit up at night reading Das Kapital by Marx, but it has all the hallmarks of a communist country. It has one-party governance. That party is authoritarian. It denies the free flow of capital and goods. It is a state-directed economy, a state-supported economy. It brutally represses Christians and other religious minorities. It is now violating international commitments almost on a weekly basis, whether it's cracking down on Hong Kong in violation of its commitments to the United Kingdom, or essentially invading India and killing 20 Indian troops. We largely overlooked all that in the 1990s. We should have known better. I mean, a cardinal tenet of the modern Chinese Communist Party, according to Deng Xiaoping, is hide your strength and bide your time. And they were hiding their strength as it accumulated, and they were biding their time. And again, it was at best a flawed experiment, more likely a terrible mistake to vote to give China permanent most favored nation status. In the 1990s, that vote happened every year. And that meant that American companies were not going to invest billions of dollars in supply chains in China if the next Chinese atrocity or a new Congress or a new president might say, we're not going to continue that. But once we made it permanent, then these American companies rushed in to the Chinese market. First, it was trying to get cheap labor. So they're taking good, high-paying American manufacturing jobs and getting cheap labor. And then it was about continuing market access into China. That's what you hear from so many of these business executives. You hear from Hollywood studios. We can't let Maverick wear a Taiwan patch on his leather jacket in Top Gun 2 because we won't be able to access the Chinese market. When was the last time you saw a movie in recent years that had the Chinese as a villain? In the way we saw movies all the time with the Soviet Union as the villain in the Cold War. You just don't see it. And that's because Hollywood is beholden not only to Chinese money coming into studios or into particular movies, they are beholden to the Chinese party to get access into a market of 1.3 billion people. So too many of our business leaders are willing to focus on short-term profitability, to sell out American workers, or trying to get access to that market without thinking through the longer-term implications of the risk it poses. Like those businesses then being shaken down by Chinese communist officials through tougher regulations, harassment through the permitting process, or the forced technology transfer to Chinese joint venture partners, and then getting kicked out and losing access to the market. This is why the FBI said the Chinese business model has been rob, replicate, replace. They rob Americans of our technology and our jobs and our innovation. They replicate it, and then they replace us. This has been their business model for a long time, and for too long, business leaders didn't recognize it. They were focused more on short-term gains and quarterly profit statements. I commend the president for helping to open a lot of eyes in Washington. I'm not sure they're fully open or if everyone's eyes are open.
It's incredible.
But the American people's eyes, I think, now are certainly open.
Well, that's, you just transitioned. I wanted to offer some hope. It's pretty dire. Up when I was in Congress, I know every morning you get the 10 papers down on the floor in the morning at the office, and the Chinese inserts are in there. And they are having a profound impact on our culture. And so now China has sent us a virus. The pandemic is global. The harm is devastating. People rationally know it's from Wuhan and from China. And yet in the suburbs, et cetera, when you see the political polling, this doesn't seem to have seeped in yet to the American people, because the political choices of President Trump has been pretty forward and aggressive on China, first president in 40 years. And so that's significant. And so I'm just, do you see any hope coming our way that folks are starting to see the cultural revolution in China in the 60s, right? They got rid of all the old culture, old religion, old leadership, old habits, old everything, right? Plow the religion away, et cetera. And now we're having a little mini cultural revolution in the States, right? Get rid of the statues, get rid of religion, get rid of education, get rid of history, get rid of this. And I'm shocked that the numbers of American people are still going with it, that they are. It seems like they would clearly go, wow, this is over the top. And so what's your assessment of the...
No, I mean, I've seen, in Arkansas, but also in my travels around the country, that voters have long had concerns about China. Concerns that unfortunately were not reflected in their elected officials in Washington for many years. And there's a lot of reasons that voters would have to be concerned or even angry about China well before this virus. Think about the factories workers who lost their job when their factory closed and moved to China. Think about the troopers and their family members who are stationed in South Korea or Japan or on ships in the Western Pacific who are worried about Chinese aggression, like those Indian troops had to worry about. Think about Christians or just human rights activists in general who are appalled by the Chinese record on human rights, on freedom of religion, on forced abortions and sterilizations, as we now see in the Xinjiang province in northwest China. There's really no end to the concerns that Americans may have had about China before the pandemic, and many of them shared those concerns or shared multiple of those concerns. But now that China has unleashed this virus on the world, obviously, the American people, I think, have seen the true face of Chinese communism.
Good. Yeah. And so some folks will go out and say they think the CCP could be a paper tiger. So there's a beige book that's got the data. The Chamber of Commerce has that data. It shows third quarter 19, all the red lights are blinking on China, showing weakness. That you buy the first airport, the rate of return is good. Second one's not so good. Third one in the same city, negative. Right, so they're trying to move to a consumption economy. But now Xi Jinping, I think, is getting concerned. He's got to feed the middle class. Economic growth used to be 10, now it's 9.8765 and maybe lower, and that's if you buy some of these numbers. What's the latest assessment you have on, and now they got the floods and the mandate of heaven, right, in the Confucius Chinese imagination. The mandate of heaven, Xi Jinping's on very shaky ground, and you're on the intelligence side. So what can you tell us?
So I would say, first off, you should never believe anything the Chinese Communist Party tells you to include so-called statistics and data. So there's no doubt that the Chinese economy has been growing at ever slower rates, and that was before the pandemic. If they say they're growing at 10, they're probably growing at 4. If they say they're growing at 6, they're probably growing flat. If they say they're growing at 4, they're probably contracting because they consistently and routinely lie to make their performance look better to their own people, because that's the bargain you hear them say they have in their system, is that we will provide stability in return for growth to help bring hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens out of poverty. As that economic engine slows down, that does put more pressure on the regime. And you saw a lot of dissatisfaction to the extent it was allowed to be expressed temporarily on social media about this virus as well. Again, let's recall that the Chinese people have been the victims of the Chinese Communist Party for over 70 years now. They understand that they are ruled by a corrupt dictatorship. They see the way Chinese officials live. They see the way they live, and they can contrast that just the way Soviet officials did as well. So I don't think that we should underestimate Beijing's ability to keep control over power, because they are ruthless communists. But at the same time, throughout history, and including recent history in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we've seen communist regimes that appeared to be firmly in power one day and to be out of power the next day. So as it is sometimes said, what at times seems impossible may soon seem inevitable.
Well, and a year ago, their GDP is approaching ours, not per capita, but total. and they're looking strong. They're going around the world. They got the Belt and Road. You say you want to fight with them strategically, right? We have three of the world-class authors coming up, and they fight on asymmetric terms, right? We say, well, if you do that to us, we're going to do that to you, and they go, we don't care. We don't care about our people. But now, as you do a world tour, Steve Bannon just referred to the Freedom Alliance. You go India, Modi, Australia, Brazil, and then sub-Saharan presidents are screaming at China right now. I don't know of they have strategic allies, but I don't know of a friend they have. Do you see a Freedom Alliance growing where the U.S., even though, there's kind of a misunderstanding with the America First policy. The America First policy is actually making us more friends globally, maybe than the old international alliance. And so how do you view our status in the world right now?
Well, I think it's strong, and especially relative to China, it's strong. China has used this pandemic in some ways to advance long-standing goals, like depriving Hong Kong of autonomy under cover of the pandemic. But China's also suffered in its international standing pretty severely from this pandemic. You didn't see this right away, in part because I think many nations were beholden to China for basic protective equipment for their nurses and doctors. Right. And they were hesitant in February and March to criticize China openly and directly, as all countries have focused more on producing more of the needed protective equipment they have, as they don't have immediate shortages, as they're not dependent on China. Many foreign officials, to me privately, to administration officials privately, have spoken about China in ways that I've never heard them be so direct. And even publicly, many countries that are small and could not stand up to China on their own have said publicly that China's responsible for this virus, that we need to change the model of how we do business with China. And that Freedom Alliance is obviously the strongest with countries like Japan and South Korea and Australia and Taiwan, India, European partners like the United Kingdom. But it's not just advanced liberal democracies. There are other countries that are not democratic that also feel as strong or more strongly about China than we do. Take Vietnam, for instance. So there is a large and growing coalition that is prepared to follow America's lead and check China's ambition on all fronts, military, economic, financial, diplomatic, political. That's what they should be doing. That's what we want them to do.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Hey, do we have a senator in the House gearing up, or are we still suffering?
I think I saw the great senator from the state of Tennessee sneak in behind you moments ago.
Okay, good. Well, I just wanted to know. Let's wrap up, Senator Cotton. When I introduced you, I said that moral integrity and a strong moral compass is rare in D.C., and yet somehow I look at your upbringing, you could have gone and cashed in easy early on. Then you go into the military and make negative pay to serve the country, and a hit to the always a hit to the family, and then you serve now. Where do you get the meaning, the spiritual resolve in your life, the strength to say, hey, someone's got to stand up here and take some arrows on behalf of this great country and on behalf of the next generation of students, the Liberty students watching you right now? Where do you get that steel inside of you? Because you've got plenty of steel.
Well, certainly from my faith and from our God.
Yep.
My wife as well.
Yeah,
my wife is very much a with your shield or on your shield kind of woman.
Right.
And I look at our two young boys and think about the future that we want them to have.
Yeah.
You know, Abraham Lincoln called America the last best hope on earth.
Right.
And America certainly is not perfect, because no human being is perfect, but we remain the last best hope on earth. The nation that stands for the God-given right of all men and women to live free, because we're all created equal in God's image, and stand up to foreign threats like the Chinese Communist Party, but also stand up to our fellow citizens who would deny that we're a great and noble nation, that think that we're somehow an irredeemable nation. I reject that root and branch, that America is worth fighting for, and if we don't fight for it, no one else will, and then what will become of the cause of human freedom and dignity on the earth.
That's super. Senator Tom Cotton, we just want to thank you from the Falkirk Center for the dedication, commitment to our country, to the faith, serving the next generation. Sometimes you hear politicians say we do it for the next generation. That phrase used to I used to get, is it a phrase? No longer. You're rare. People like you are rare that are standing up and taking it. And so folks at home, action items. If your Congress member or senator is not signed on to the Senator Cotton bills, they should be. That's a good indicator, right? If you want a voting scorecard, there's your scorecard sitting right there. And so, Senator, it's just an absolute pleasure to have you with us today, and God bless you in everything you do. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you, and thanks, Liberty and the Falkirk Center.
All right, awesome.
Right.
You're in for a treat today. We have a superhero in the House. I used to have the privilege and honor of serving with her. She was a leader in the House, a leader to everyone in the House, now to the President of the United States. She has since moved up, it's no surprise, to Senate. Everybody in the press and around D.C. knows there are people that fight and there are people that really fight and stick to their principles. And today it's an honor for us at the Falkirk Center to have in the House Senator Marsha Blackburn. And so let's welcome her to the Falkirk Center, everybody.
Thank you so much. I
you,
appreciate that, Dave. Thank you, and I appreciate being with you all today. Now, I've already heard from some of you, and I know that you're aware that last week I published a white paper on what to do about China, and it has more than 120 specific recommendations of what we need to be doing as we work to unravel this relationship with China. Now, for those of you who have not seen it, it is at blackburn.senate.gov. China white paper, and I would encourage you to take a look. As you can see, it's not that big, so it's not that heavy reading, but it is a good guideline for what we should do. And I did it because when I'm out and about in Tennessee, people will say, China's a problem. And then they will say, somebody needs to hold them to account. And then the follow-on has always been, so what are we going to do about China? And one of the reasons I put the time and resources into creating this guide is because of what we are seeing right now. The same Marxist philosophies used by the Chinese Communist Party filling the streets of Portland, Chicago, and even a few blocks away from right where we are right now here in Washington, D.C. Now, these rioters claim they're fighting for criminal justice reform, but consider the tactics. You can trace all of it. The destruction of cultural symbols, the devaluing of the nuclear family, and the complete rejection of history. You can trace all of it back to Marx. They've brought modern-day mind control to children, teens, and college students via social media and digital entertainment. They jazz it up with music or dancing, but at the end of the day, it's all part of a larger effort to normalize ideological conformity in younger generations. And while it's true that not every police reform protester wants to destroy the institutions that keep us safe, that's exactly what the people behind the scenes are seeking to do. All that fancy, Instagram-worthy packaging is just a distraction from the destructive philosophies that are driving the movement. And my goal with the white paper and with the various pieces of legislation I've sponsored that directly target China is to make sure that we don't let all this chaos distract us from the threat that the communists in Beijing pose to our safety and our sovereignty. The goal of this pop culture-driven socialism is to completely whitewash the dangers posed by godless, ideological conformity and total government control. This is the kind of system that allowed the Chinese Communist Party to spend 51 days muzzling doctors, lawyers, and journalists who tried to warn the world about COVID-19. Those 51 days would have made a difference between the life and death for millions of people. But the CCP said nothing because the illusion of control was more important to them than saving lives. Our relationship with China is broken. There's no sense in denying it. But it is so important to remember that there's no single-shot strategy or bill we can count on to sever those ties and regain control. We are going to have to unravel this relationship with China. Now, as I mentioned, the paper I put out last week contains more than 120 specific recommendations that run the policy gamut from higher education to manufacturing to military strategy. But I want to go through just a few I think you'll be interested in. The first item I want to address is the broader problem of China's stranglehold on the global economy. Most, if not all of you, know that Beijing has used their Belt and Road Initiative to stretch their influence across Asia, Africa, and Europe, and through most of the major sea lanes. These carefully placed investments are really just a Trojan horse for military, economic, and political inroads into a nation's good graces. Because the BRI financing model is so opaque, we can only estimate what China's growing economic influence is in developing countries and what it looks like. But it's probably somewhere between, get this number, $1 and $8 trillion. And those trillions of dollars buy inroads and influence across countries of every economic background and in organizations like the United Nations that tout diplomacy and consensus as their guiding principles. Now, you may recall that since 2015, the UN General Assembly has profoundly propped up 101 resolutions condemning Israel and exactly 0 condemning China. Over 100 to 0. Think about that ratio. For the record, they've condemned the United States 6 times, making our record worse than those of Iran, North Korea, and Burma. That is what Chinese influence looks like. And while we cannot and should not compete dollar for dollar with their shady investments, we do need to partner with our allies to support developing countries and keep China's debt traps from sucking in desperate leaders. But if we really want to get to the heart of Chinese influence, we have to secure our emerging 5G systems. To that end, we need to make more spectrum available for the commercial wireless sector to ensure that our continued economic and technological leadership in 5G and other emerging technologies does not fall behind. If we fail to do so, we risk ceding ground to China in the standard-setting bodies that will define 5G globally. We'll also have to share information about threats and risk with our allies, which is a lot more complicated than it sounds. But 5G isn't the only place we're vulnerable. China's COVID shutdowns caused major disruptions in global supply chains. Because we're in the middle of a pandemic, most of the media attention, when we could get some of that attention, focused on prescription drugs and medical supplies. My Securing America's Medicine Cabinet, or SAMC Act, is currently pending in the Senate, and it's really the first step to ending our overdependence on China for active pharmaceutical ingredients and medications. The bill, which is bipartisan, would incentivize companies to bring their manufacturing operations back to the U.S. and also fund partnerships between universities and pharmaceutical companies so that they could train the workforce that we truly need in order to decouple the supply chain from China. And, of course, we need to inventory all of our critical medicines we depend on, which are supplied to us or manufactured, many exclusively in China. And we have to develop a surge capacity for PPE, and we need to eliminate all the regulatory red tape standing in the way of innovation. Now, that is just one portion of the economy, but look at how much has to be done to unravel that relationship that exists in pharmaceuticals. I've also recommended we prioritize supply chain security for medical devices, natural resources like the rare earth elements that make your phones work, and unmanned aerial systems. It's going to take a lot of focus and a lot of collaboration. If we're going to invest in all this new technology, we need to invest in some serious security updates to protect it. The CCP uses a variety of tactics to infiltrate our research communities, which means we're going to have to cut off their connections to our colleges and universities, grant-making agencies, and think tanks. I'm leading a multi-part effort to get Confucius Institutes off of American college campuses. Right now, we have 2 separate bills targeting these propaganda mills. And I'm also maintaining a constant dialogue with Secretary DeVos, and yes, Senator Cotton is working with me as we seek to get these Confucius Institutes and also the 500 Confucius classrooms that are in our K-12 schools in this country. China admits this is part of their soft power. It's time for them to exit. We're also working on additional prohibitions against visas for Chinese nationals who want to come to the States for graduate or postgraduate work in STEM fields. So these are just a handful of the recommendations. We know this is an uphill battle because right now, even in the face of so much evidence that officials in Beijing are doing all they can to replace Western ideals with their own version of Marxism, we're getting a lot of resistance from global leaders who are absolutely terrified of angering the CCP. They're allowing these communists to hold their economies hostage. They're ignoring the impunity with which officials in Beijing violate the human rights of their own people, steal intellectual property, and commit blatant acts of espionage. It really feels like it's an us versus them many days of the week. You can expect that the Chinese will push against what we're doing. You can expect them to accelerate their activity, to escalate their hostility. they'll move beyond shuttering our embassies and keep trying to escalate the conflict. But the good news is we know what to expect. We have decades of history at our disposal, so we know what their Marxist curriculum looks like. I'll tell you, if my colleagues on the left and the protesters in the streets really looked at what it is that they're defending, I think they would be shocked and appalled. It falls on us, each and every one of us, to be champions of freedom and to stand in between communist China and our fellow countrymen, even if they don't yet understand what it is that we are defending and they are fighting. Thank you so very much. And there's your copy of the
Thank you very much. All right, everybody. You got no excuses. White Paper Senator Marsha Blackburn. Google it, pick it up, read it, and get educated. Thank you so much for
Absolutely.
your comments. One of the premises of this conference is that everything else hangs on one proposition, and that is China sent us the virus. The economic carnage, 40 million Americans displaced, all of it. The deaths, the sickness, the sports, the schools, the bankruptcies, all from the virus. How do you position yourself on that issue? How strong? Was it intentional? Was it by accident? What do we know now at this level?
You know, the way I started on the China issue goes back into the mid-90s. And I was the head of Tennessee's Film, Entertainment, and Music Commission in Tennessee, part of our governor's cabinet and team. And one of the things we began to see was how China was pirating music and TV shows and movies. So I brought that with me to Congress, and in 2003 started the Songwriters Caucus to work on intellectual property. And you were a big supporter of that effort when you were in the House. And as we continued, we started to see not only did they affect our creative community, but our innovative community, our auto engineers, and people that were doing aftermarket auto parts. They would have their patents infringed on, or even like Gibson guitars. They would be knocked off in China and end up here. And then we started seeing it fall into pharmaceuticals. So this is something I've been working on now since 2003. And
everybody hear that? That's amazing.
Yeah, and the thing that has happened, though, Dave, is that now what people are doing after COVID, they have brought this into their home. It has personally affected them. And I was talking yesterday with someone in Tennessee, and this lady said, you know, I needed to buy some new linens. So in my search engine, I put made in the USA sheets and towels, and because she didn't want to buy anything that had been made in China. And when it comes to consumer goods, so many people are saying that. When it comes to furniture out of hardwoods or flooring and using even some of the softwoods and pine, people are saying, I want it U.S. made. I don't want to buy anything made from China. And of course, this carries over to semiconductor chips and also to our critical supply chains, whether it's PPE, pharmaceuticals. You're seeing it also with our military complex. And people are saying, let's return our manufacturing stateside. Make America manufacture again. And maybe we turn the old Rust Belt into a pharmaceutical belt.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. When you look around the world in the Senate, you have a fairly small club there. I was glad to see a 98-0 vote on that thrift savings plan piece coming to Democrats, bipartisan. That's hopeful. And now around the world, you see a lot of countries, Japan, very strong with us. Now in India and sub-Saharan Africa and a bunch of countries who are giving China a look. But now, after the virus, Xi Jinping looks a little more wobbly. How do you, a year or two ago, I would have said, whoa, we're in trouble, we better wake up. And no one was awake.
Yeah.
You were sounding the bells and a few others, but not many. But now, what's your assessment? How strong is China? And how do you assess our new friends coming on board?
Right, and when you talk about Xi Jinping, you're saying it exactly right. And right now, they feel like, since people are beginning to say, hey, wait a minute, when it comes to China, that they have to hit the accelerator. And what they want to do is double down on their efforts. What we have to keep in mind is China wanted the 21st century to be the Chinese dominant century. That's their goal. So that means that we're the ones that they have to diminish and destroy. And so if you go back and you look at the time of Mao, and the way Mao approached the Chinese people, you're seeing a good bit of this repeated with Xi Jinping. You look at what is happening with the efforts against Hong Kong. You look at what is happening with the Uyghurs and concentration camps. You look how China has pushed back against Taiwan and tried to minimize their impact. You look at what they're doing with their aggression in the South China Sea. And then from there, you look at this debt diplomacy, the Horn of Africa, what they're doing in Djibouti with the port. And you see they are trying to set up a long game. And for us, what we have to realize is we have to unravel this relationship. And I will tell you, I think in this, we have to role model for other nations how they can unravel this relationship. So that they don't feel like they're alone. They feel like how that we're going to help them with this. But that relationship that we have with our allies like Japan over in that ASEAN region, so that they are standing with us, is going to be vitally important. Plus, when you look at the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House, we need people that understand and appreciate that relationship and realize that we have to have our allies with us as we push back on China and keep them from having further aggressive actions.
Right. Excellent. Excellent. That's a great model going forward. We're going to have a few authors with us on the stage in an hour. And I think you've read all the books we've talked about. Unrestricted War, written by the Chinese, couple colonels, 1999. They're prescient. Now they're generals. They said, we're at war with you in 99. And then Bill Gertz deceiving this guy, and General Rob Spaulding, stealth war, all the same, right? Deceiving this guy, stealth war.
Lie, cheat, steal.
Lie, cheat, steal. And the American people, I mean, you grow up, you're in the heartland, representing the heartland. Right. And they're all good people, right? The Judaeo Christian tradition is strong. They care about people. They love people. They want to help people. Are your folks able to take in some of the deeds that China is showing us? Like when they read about Mao and the Cultural Revolution and killing 60 million people, I mean, can they absorb this, that, hey, other people don't think the way we think? And it's not the Chinese people. This whole conference is set, this is the CCP, right? We want to free 1.4 billion people from bondage so that they can have faith and have freedom in this. But do you think, are the American people, the Judaeo Christian ethos is still strong? And can they see that other people can do evil to us so that we can fight back? These guys say we're at war. Are we at war or not?
With China, I think it is not a stretch to use the term that this is a Cold War. Because of how we're going to have to break away from some of our relationship with them and some of our allies. Boris Johnson, with his decision not to allow Huawei into their 5G, that was a huge win for us. But you know, one of the things that has happened is the confluence of events that we have seen with COVID, with the rioters and the destruction and what you're seeing on the streets. And, you know, you have some of these rioters the groups will say we're trained Marxist.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
causing people to wake up and say, hey, wait a minute.
Yeah.
We don't like that. Peaceful protest is wonderful. We should protect peaceful protest, and we should honor and protect free speech. But rioting, vandalism, destruction, loss of life, that is not okay.
Yeah.
And we have to, people are beginning to look at the linkages.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you went there. I mean, I told you all you had a fighter here, and your remarks earlier on Marxism, and now in the streets here, the activists have self-proclaimed themselves. They say, we're trained and steeped in Marxist ideology. And for those who don't know what that is, right, I was in academia for 30 years, but it's very simple. The American people are builders. We construct things. We built the faith.
Right.
We built the rule of law, the Constitution. We built businesses. We built the free market system. And the Marxists are deconstructionists. They're tearing down the statues. They're creating violence. The Marxists always promise you utopia around the corner, right? They say, trust us,
Yes.
give up your rights. And
Give us everything and we will give you back what you need.
yeah, right. We'll give you the minimum. And so it's so refreshing to hear. Politicians usually won't go there. And you go there, and are your constituents starting to see that this Marxist link to the radicals in the streets across the United States, and that the CCP is saying, hey, we like this? They are saying
Yeah,
this.
what they've watched and talked to me about is watching the Hong Kong protesters.
Oh, great.
And watching them fight for freedom, and then hearing Great Britain and Boris Johnson say, hey, we've got your back.
Yep.
If they won't let you be free,
Right,
we
right.
will allow you here.
Yep.
And that perked a lot of people up, and they
Good.
started to pay attention to that.
Good.
And so many of my friends from church, our church, we're very invested in mission programs.
Yeah, super.
And we know the impact of a socialistic or a communistic regime,
Right.
and how it limits free speech and free thought and the practice of religion and freedom of expression. And you've seen that, and you ache because you want to help people and free them. And that's one of the things. I had a great conversation with someone from a Bible study group I'm in, and we talked about how, and they had just realized this, we never go in and control land when we free people.
Right, right.
We leave. We help you
Right,
with your
that's
freedom.
right, that's right.
And the Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, communists, they all come in and then they control and dominate. And they take the bounty unto themselves, unto the government, and take it from the people. And we say, go forward, be prosperous, and dream your dreams and make them come true. And that's the difference between that communistic control and system and the difference in freedom. And you know, it's also one of the reasons I've been kind of pushing U.S. companies, like the NBA.
Yep.
The NBA is so deeply tied to the Chinese Communist Party with some of their business relationships,
Right,
and
right.
China TV and Alibaba and those things, and keep pushing them. Fortunately, they ended the training facility in Xinjiang. They had confirmed that to me in a letter I got last week.
Right, right.
But here's the thing, the NBA should take every penny of profit that they are making off China, and they should put it into a fund to help these Uyghurs,
Yeah.
to help these Hong Kong freedom fighters
Yep.
for the oppression that they have had to bear,
Yeah.
and the persecution that they have suffered.
Right.
They should not use that profit for that violation of human rights to themselves.
Yeah, I'll ask you two-part. You don't got to do the first part. But when I was in Congress, the Democrats are charming individuals. You talk with them.
Yeah.
But there's been a shift on the faculty from when I started 30 years ago. They went from liberals, root word liberty, that used to respect a dialogue and a debate. And are your colleagues, have you seen a shift, just in general, not specifically but in the House and the Senate, Are the liberals leaving and the leftists taking over? And how do you characterize that transition?
You know, there is more of a tendency to tilt left. You know, they would call themselves progressive Democrats. Now, you will hear some refer to themselves as leftist.
Yep.
And it is something that is of concern to me. And here is why. Freedom and freedom's cause and the retention of freedom and liberty. And the USA is the beacon of freedom and liberty to the world. We retain that because we have robust, respectful, bipartisan debate. That is essential. I have very good friends who are classic liberals and who are Democrats. And I appreciate their opinion. I learn from them and I enjoy conversations with them. But the impact of the cancel culture has really made it very difficult for so many people to step forward and say what they believe. I talk to, especially to women who are independent or conservative. They say, I just don't say anything anymore. I'm just totally quiet. I don't put anything on social media. I just stay away from all conversation. And to me, that is very sad because we want people to have these debates.
Exactly.
And to have this point and counterpoint and have that dialogue and learn from one another and to live in a time, I think it's very sad that right now that is frowned upon and is not encouraged.
That's amazing. Well, I want to thank you for being with us today. Before we close, though, I'm going to just do a little housekeeping here. You're in the Senate. You're very civilized. Do I hear some of the barbarians at the gates? Are any of my House members back there? Hey, team.
They're talking.
Somebody's chatting. We have a couple of House guys back there. We got one ready to roll. Well, good. We've had some traffic delays because of our great leader in state. And so, I just want to thank Senator Marsha Blackburn for being with you. You've just heard wisdom that we need in our leadership in the Senate. And I think she's going to be leadership in the Senate, if not at the peak of our country. In the not too distant future. Keep your eyes open. She speaks the truth. You've heard the track record. She's not a newcomer when it comes to first principles, the Judaeo Christian tradition, or taking on China when they need it. And so the Falkirk Center, dedicated to faith and freedom, has a true champion in Senator Marsha Blackburn, my good friend. God bless you, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Awesome.
Bye. Thank you. All right.
Thank you so much. Excellent. Excellent.
Well, welcome back to America's Voice. I'm Raheem Kassam. We're live from the Trump International Hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. for this amazing Falkirk Center Freedom Summit. Protecting the Republic from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And up next, America's Voice's own Dr. Gina Loudon will take the stage with Dave Bratt and Congressman of the United States, Jim Banks and Dan Crenshaw. So don't go anywhere. It's going to be a barnstormer. You're going to want to pay very close attention to that. Speaking of foreign and domestic, I am obviously foreign, and we have domestic here with us as well in the studio. Natalie Winters is a senior reporter at thenationalpulse.com. I am the editor of thenationalpulse.com. So naturally, I would have Natalie on with me this afternoon. And we're very grateful for you, Natalie, joining us here on America's Voice at this time. Look, we're in the middle of this conference here, which is really a sea change moment in the United States, especially here, moments away from Capitol Hill. We are parked right between Capitol Hill and the White House right now. That's where we're bringing you this conference from. And it's incredibly important because for a long time, it felt like we were voices in the wilderness shouting about the Chinese Communist Party. But now it appears that a lot more voices are coming to this party, this fight, this movement, this group of people who are incredibly brave, because what's happening here is people standing up to the Chinese Communist Party. You have to understand the Chinese Communist Party, they don't mess around if you mess around with them. And for all intents and purposes, the CCP has believed that this coming generation, this coming era, is the era of communism in the Chinese mold. They're bringing that to the United States. So I want to talk about this because Dr. Gina is going to be on stage in just a moment, and really they're going to be talking about a couple of things here which I have in front of me. The virus, of course, that the CCP sent and exported all around the world. The silent war that's being fought in technology, information, education, economics. Family life in the United States and how it's being impacted by the Chinese Communist Party. But also, Natalie, I want to get to you about some of the political implications. Many of you will know there's an election coming up. And if you don't know, it's time to know, because early voting is effectively starting very soon in many states across the country. And the camps seem to be split at the moment between what I call Beijing Biden, somebody who has kowtowed and really prostrate himself before the Chinese Communist Party for a great many decades, and President Trump, who, as the Financial Times said this weekend, has really focused his administration's ire geopolitically upon the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the Financial Times would have you believe that the greatest geopolitical threat to the United States is still Russia, which is manifestly a nonsense, I think, when you look at the dodgy dossier that we now know the origins of this dossier, the PP dossier, as you know, it became known in Washington, D.C., really laundered through a lot of the intelligence services, laundered through a lot of the Western intelligence services outside the United States as well. But they're still trying to say that Russia is the biggest geopolitical adversary. And Natalie Winters, I just want you to explain. I mean, you are probably one of the foremost reporters on the Chinese Communist Party and its influence in the United States. And, you know, for the audience watching at home as well, you can probably tell Natalie is a young woman who, and I won't out your age here, but is a young woman who has come to this, you know, in the last year or so and really started to dive into this stuff. But you've broken story upon story upon story. First of all, I want you to explain to our audience, without giving your secret techniques away, but explain to your audience how you're breaking all of these stories, because often we get asked, hey, you know, you must be on the take from some foreign intelligence service who are feeding you all these stories. It's just not true. What Natalie does is the good old-fashioned reporting technique of actually digging through documents, right? So Natalie, just tell us a little bit about what you do over at the National Pulse and what are some of the big stories that we've seen and that we can expect.
Sure. Well, whether it's a local public school in Utah to a prestigious academic institution like Harvard, or even establishment media outlets like CNN and BBC, you see the Chinese Communist Party not just infiltrating these institutions, but keen on completely requisitioning them to use to their advantage. And like you've pointed out, our thought leaders, our elites, our establishment, politicians, even business leaders fundamentally misunderstand what the Chinese Communist Party is and the threat that it poses to all of us. For example, I've pointed out that CNN, as we know, an establishment news outlet that is no fan of President Trump, there's a revolving door between former reporters at that outlet and China Global Television Network, which is a registered foreign agent here in the United States. What's more, yes.
Let me just interrupt you there, Natalie, because we're actually going to toss to the stage right now here at the Trump International Hotel. Dr. Gina Loudon taking the stage right now with Dave Bratt. We'll come back to you, Natalie, with more in just a second. Over to Dr. Gina and Dave Bratt.
Women have been battling this topic their entire careers and really their entire lives. Both sacrificed greatly, as I like to quote, with their lives in military service, and then decided that wasn't quite enough to give up for our country, that they wanted to then go even farther and to give the gift of their time and their talent and their sacrifice in our Congress, fighting on the issue of fighting communism, fighting the CCP in our Congress. Now, I'm going to tell you, as the wife of a former senator from Missouri, there are issues you can take on and be a hero, and then there are issues you can take on and be pelted for it on a daily basis, that take courage and fortitude and personal sacrifice. And this issue is an issue that if you're going to take this on, your family is going to be hit, your children are going to be hit, you are going to be hit personally on a daily basis. Death threats are just the beginning of the things that are going to happen to you if you take on the issues that these two just courageous men of men have taken on. And so that's why it's truly an honor for me to get to introduce two of the bravest that we have among us in this country today. They're the hope for our businesses, they're the hope for our children and their future, and they're the hope for the continuation of our republic in this United States of America. Welcome warmly, Representative Jim Banks and Representative Dan Crenshaw. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
And I want to just start, gentlemen, by just opening it to whoever would like to take it first. In passing, what is your statement on the culpability of China's moral responsibility in this virus? Let's go to you first, Congressman.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, there's what we know that we can talk about, what we know that we can't talk about, that we've been briefed on behind closed doors in a classified setting. What we can say is that we can get hung up on whether or not the coronavirus or COVID-19 was intentionally released and thrust upon the rest of the world and intended to destroy and affect harm on Americans, or we could put that discussion aside for a moment, which is what I prefer to do. What we know at the end of the day, what we can talk about is that we know that by China preventing the CDC and the WHO in January from coming in to study COVID-19 at the beginnings of the outbreak, by refusing to allow two international organizations and an American organization, the CDC, to study those, Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, says that, and he discusses a study that shows that 90% of cases of COVID-19 would have been avoided if we could have gone in January when we tried to investigate the beginnings of COVID-19 and to better understand it. That alone is why China is morally culpable, why they should be held accountable for the spread of the coronavirus. Back in 2005, China and the United States and a number of other countries around the world signed on to international health regulations with the UN to stop the spread of a pandemic that you harken back to that and look at what we're dealing with now. They violated many of the regulations that they signed on to in 2005, and they should be held accountable for it. And right now, they're not. Right now, we fortunately have an administration in the White House who is intent upon holding them accountable. But I fear what that's going to look like after this next election if things change and we go back to an era in American politics where we turn a blind eye to not just the coronavirus, but to a lot of other activities on the part of the Chinese Communist Party where we don't hold them accountable.
And I want to get to that because without being political at all, this is an educational, not a political event, but without being political at all, there are two candidates in this race, and both of them have laid out very binary plans that are not divergent really in any way. And not only that, both of them have demonstrated, Vice President Biden, as part of the Obama administration, had a very distinct policy and plan, right, for the CCP, and President Trump has taken a completely different plan, different lane, different road. I want to get to that. But I want to move to you, Representative Crenshaw, and I want you to talk about what is the price that China should have to pay? What should the reprisal be for what has happened?
And I want to add a couple things as well to what Jim said. China knew there was a virus. They cut off travel domestically inside of China between Wuhan and other cities in China, but not internationally. So again, I completely agree with the take that Jim had on this. We can question their intent, but we do know their actions. They did allow it to spread, and then they also spread misinformation through their contacts at the World Health Organization, and even as recently, they would not allow scientists to investigate the origins of the virus. There's more than that. They actually prevented exports of PPE as well. So there's quite a few things to add to the list there. Now, what should be the price of that? That's where, of course, the complication or the discussion gets rather complicated. First of all, we need a realignment. We need a change in paradigm on how we view China. We need to view them as what they are. It's an adversarial relationship. It's not quite like the Cold War, where I think you could argue the Soviet Union wanted to see America implode within. I don't think that's what China necessarily wants. They don't want to see the utter destruction of the United States, where our economies are too closely intertwined. But what they do want is to spread their domestic, their domestic outlook onto the world. So we have a liberal global world order that has long been protected by the United States. The Chinese want to take that over and replace it with a mercantilist system, with an authoritarian regime run by them. So that's how they operate domestically, and I think they want to export that internationally. That's what the Belt and Road Initiative is. It's a Belt and Road Initiative which allows a market-based system to work, but the rules of the road they want to dictate. So that's what they want to export, and we need to be fully conscious of that. And when you look at the difference between Biden and Trump, Biden's been in office for quite a long time, well before I was born, and he is part of this notion that we should help China's rise, and that if we do that, they will enter the liberal global order in a responsible way and adhere to our values. That is simply not true, and it's certainly not clear to me that Biden, for one, has realized that.
So backing up to their culpability and responsibility on COVID, what should the response of the United States be? What price should China pay specifically? What does that look like in order to prevent perhaps the next pandemic?
Well, I have one bill that would make them pay quite a literal price. It basically allows U.S. citizens to use our court system to sue China for damages. Now, in reality, what does that look like? It looks like possibly a class action lawsuit that goes after their state-owned enterprises. Do I expect Xi Jinping to write us all a big check? No, I do not. But it's one thing among many that we can do. We need to encourage these investigations. We need to get to the bottom of it, and we need to come up with creative ideas, because that is not a simple answer. How do we make them pay? Again, that's why I reverted to the broader discussion of it's a realignment. It's competing with them on multiple fronts against intellectual property theft. We just closed down the consulate in my district in Houston, which is being used to spy on the Texas Medical Center to get access to the technologies and vaccines. And so now they want to make money off of the virus that they were hiding from everybody. I mean, so we absolutely need to hold them accountable for this.
And Congressman Banks, if you would speak to what degree of help should we expect from our allies in this?
Last week, Secretary Pompeo gave what I believe is the most significant speech that he's given during his time in the Trump administration as Secretary of State. Coincidentally, he gave it at the Richard Nixon Library, which is symbolic in and of itself, as the president who opened the door to that led down to the path to normalizing relations with China. In that speech, Secretary Pompeo talked about leveraging our allies abroad and creating a coalition of the free world versus communist China, not just in an effort to hold them accountable, but this realignment that Dan is talking about, much in the same way that we formed coalitions around our activities in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's time that we begin to build that coalition of Western countries who believe in Western values. I mean, if you really boil this down, it's the repressive authoritarian regime and values of the Chinese Communist Party versus the free and open democratic values of the United States of America and most of our allies. And that's the dividing line. What Dan is describing, whether we have incredible, significant examples in recent months, whether it's the NBA. I'm from Indiana. We love basketball in Indiana, and I can't tell you how sick in the stomach it made me feel when the leadership and many of the best basketball players of our day groveled to China and to Chinese Communist Party values versus the values of the country that they come from. Those powerful examples show you what we're up against. Will the next American century be one that's governed by American interest, or will we all subject ourselves to what LeBron James and so many other NBA players have in chasing the almighty dollar in the interest of what China wants us to believe in? And that's what we're up against. That's what we can't allow to happen. And that's why Secretary Pompeo's historic speech at the Nixon Library last week, this administration, bottom line, is the only administration in my lifetime that has sought to be tough on China through tougher trade deals, building up our military in a way that could combat the Chinese military. This administration, in its very first year, released the national security strategy that called for great power competition with China and getting ourselves out of other important, I mean, Dan and I both agree that what's going on in the Middle East is not just important today and yesterday, but it's going to be important for a long time to come. But to build up a military that can combat the China threat in a way that our military over the last decade, really the last generation, has not been able to do. So that powerful statement by Secretary Pompeo on rallying our allies to join us in that endeavor is something significant that we shouldn't lose sight of.
So you bring up a great point. How do we classify whatever it is we're engaged in? I mean, if it's a war, is it an informational war? Is it a technological war? Is it a medical war? I mean, we know that there's a lot of battle on that front. What is this that we are engaged in? How do you classify it?
Well, the administration calls it great power competition. At least it did in 2017. And since then, as this administration builds upon that, I mean, this administration, it seems, all of us feel like we've been through a very long movie, right? The last 4 years. Where we are today with Secretary Pompeo, National Security Advisor O'Brien, this president has surrounded himself with the leading minds of our time that understand that the greatest existential threat that we face in America today is China, economically and militarily.
But it's interesting, and I want to stop you for just 1 second there because I want you to address that. If you watch the news today, on any network except perhaps the one that I work for, and very few other exceptions, you're going to hear that the greatest threat we have today is Russia, not China. So continue.
Or those mainstream media outlets will tell you that the greatest threat we face today is the president of our own country, sadly. When this president is the only president in my lifetime that's identified the true threat that we face in China. I would say this: we can't fight the new and win the new Cold War if we're constantly engaged in the civil war that we are engaged in American society today. That's what I'm concerned about. And this election, while this isn't a political conference, and I understand that the challenges or the restrictions that we have to talk about politics, the election in November is all about whether or not we will continue down a path of recognizing the greatest threat that we face in China, or whether we'll retreat to past, and not just the Obama administration, but Republican administrations too, who have fully turned a blind eye to the China threat, whether allowing them to join the WTO or altogether ignoring their violations of many international laws, or stealing our IP, stealing our jobs, or thrusting coronavirus on us without ever being held accountable for it.
I think the best way to describe it is a conflict of visions. We have a different vision for how to govern, and so our vision is one where people are allowed to self-govern, live freely, choose their own government, and pursue their own happiness. That's a particular vision where human nature can be the left and right parameters can be set by democratic institutions, but you cannot fundamentally change the nature of man. The vision of the Chinese is much different. They do believe in the ability to form human nature and to create a collective, and basically any means justify those ends. I mean, you can see it now. You're putting Uyghurs. They're putting Uyghurs in concentration camps, shaving their heads. There was an instance we just saw where our customs seized a bunch of human hair that had come from Uyghurs. It was being shipped here to make hair braids. I mean, it's horrible what's happening over there, and this is because they have a totally different vision of humanity. They have a different vision for civilization, and they want to export that vision. And this is the essential conflict on how they perceive the freedom of the individual. What scares me the most is that vision it's not as toxic as you might think to American minds, especially young ones. So what are we seeing right now in America? What's our civil war? It is also a conflict of visions, and it's fundamentally that as well. The progressive belief is a top-down belief that people should think the way they want them to, that people should speak the way they want them to. And again, the means justify the ends, because there's always some kind of utopia that they're trying to achieve. Now, utopianism has a pretty bad history in humanity. It always results in a lot of people dead, just like Maoism resulted in tens of millions of people dead. And now they're basically just re-energizing that same kind of vision. And again, when you talk about utopianism, again, it's very romantic. It's people are susceptible to it, especially young people, because maybe deep down they are morally good and they want to achieve something better. But what they fail to understand is the foundations for success that created America, the foundations of economic freedom, of personal freedom, of rights, a culture of rights. That is something that only we have in America. And I mean it, only we have that. There is no Bill of Rights in Great Britain or even Canada. Their freedom of speech can be trampled on. Ours cannot be by law. Now it is, okay, and that's a different discussion about cancel culture, but at least we have a culture of rights, and we're losing that to this conflicting vision, and the Chinese are happy to perpetuate that. It's not to say the Russians aren't a threat. The Russians are very good at this information warfare because they've been doing it for a very long time. They've been playing this conflict of visions game, for a century, and they're very good at it. The Chinese are getting better at it, and we need to be going into this with eyes wide open.
When you talk to people about this topic, which obviously you must have to do every single day, when you have the opportunity to try to wake them up, what does that light bulb moment look like? Like how? Because I feel like so much of the country is asleep on this. Like it's technical, it's over their head. They don't understand the geopolitics. They don't understand the history. Our children aren't even taught that in school anymore. So you can't really harken back to, Mao, because they don't even really know what you're talking about. You can't even harken back as far as World War II because they don't even really know that history. So Congressman, how do you wake up the population that doesn't understand history, doesn't understand the geopolitical situation, doesn't even really understand our Constitution? Yeah. What's that light bulb look like?
That's the $1 million question, and that's why we're in such a difficult battle here, because it takes another generation of teaching the right principles to counter generations of teaching the wrong principles.
But we don't have that time. So where do we, as an audience today, where do we start on this? I mean,
in your individual conversations, ask questions of the person. If you're trying to persuade somebody, again, without knowing the topic that we're, and that person's demeanor and how they're coming at it, and which misconceptions they already have built into their mind, right? It depends, right? And so what I find best to do is to simply ask questions. Ask the questions that you wish a reporter would ask them. Don't confront them with your ideology, because what does somebody do? They automatically get defensive, and it's very hard to change somebody's mind. The facts do not matter at a certain point once you're emotionally attached to an argument. And so helping them reason through in sort of this Socratic method is generally speaking my best advice, without knowing the context of that particular conversation, my best advice for how to persuade somebody. But it takes work. It takes work. And that's why I say it's a generation. It's a generational battle.
I actually find where I come from, people do get it. I don't have to educate them about it, because farmers in Northeast Indiana have seen what bad trade deals with China have done to devastate their markets. Where I come from, we make things. We have more manufacturing jobs per capita in my district than any district in the country. We make cars, we make medical devices. And I talk to businesses every day who have experienced, either themselves or someone in their supply chain has experienced IP theft. So working class hardworking middle-class families in my district have seen China wreak havoc on our economy. This is why Donald Trump was elected in 2016 to begin with, and why he got over 70% of the vote in a district like mine, which is one of these blue-collar type districts that he's always done very well in, I think, because of this China issue. So today, most of the same people are sitting back and wondering, why aren't we doing enough to hold them accountable for what we're suffering through at the moment? And I don't have a lot of complaints about the administration, but I do wish that this administration would rise up and be tougher to hold China accountable for the coronavirus, for the $3.5 trillion that we've added to our national debt already, that's going to grow in the weeks and months to come, and for the long-term damage that has been done to so many working class people who have seen their wages scaled back or lost their job altogether. Their lives have been disrupted in a substantial way. They want this president, who they voted for in 2016 on a platform of holding China accountable, to do exactly that right now for what we're going through today.
I want to hear you both lay out, again, this is an educational summit, but I want to hear you both lay out what this really looks like in terms of, Joe Biden has been in public office for almost half a century, almost 50 years. So we have a long record to look at. But we have a recent presidency of Donald Trump, and so we know what that looks like generally. If Joe Biden is elected, what does that relationship with China look like? If President Trump is reelected, what does that relationship with the CCP look like? And what does that mean in terms of real lives, real Americans, real families in the Midwest, real families in Texas? What does that mean to the average American? I want to hear both of you speak to that.
Yeah, the answer is simple. I mean, we have, as Dan said, we have a 50-year framework of what it would look like if it were a President Biden in the White House dealing with China. Joe Biden, as senator and later as vice president, was at the helm when we normalized relations with China, when we allowed them to enter the WTO, when we largely turned a blind eye toward China cheating economically, from steel dumping to a lot of other bad trade practices that did a lot of damage to the American economy. So we can assume that Joe Biden in the White House isn't going to be a lot different than Joe Biden as senator or vice president. Donald Trump, on the other hand, turned everything upside down. I mean, for the moment he was elected, whether it was negotiating a new trade deal, which has been much forgotten, but the merits of that trade deal are so fundamentally important, and expecting more and demanding more from our trade deals with China, to what he's done to build a better relationship with India in the region, which is a very significant partner that we have, and even growing our relationship even further with Japan. I mean, Japan was a reluctant ally with us during the Obama years. They're a powerful ally. President Trump is often underestimated his ability to go in and build a rapport with some of these world leaders like Abe and others in the region, that he can call at a moment's notice and leverage as we build up this coalition and alliance that we need to put greater pressure on China. That's the difference. Biden gives us a record and an idea of what he would be in the White House, and President Trump has shown it.
Yeah, I think it's an acquiescence versus standing up to them. I think Biden continues to acquiesce. And another way to look at this is left-wing culture does inform left-wing politics. The same way right-wing culture can inform right-wing politics. Politics is downstream of culture. And when you see institutions on the left, which is unfortunately basically all of the institutions of Hollywood, the NBA, to name some examples, acquiescing to China, that does inform left-wing politicians. That's their base. Mm-hmm. So that matters quite a bit. So we can assume that Biden is not going to take the steps that Trump has taken. Biden would never slap tariffs on China. I don't think he would. Now, even I was, because it's a bold move. And even I was questioning it at first, because, well, it's a bit of a tax on us. But I have to admit that the it did give us more leverage. I have to admit some of these things. You know, and I bet Jim was probably in the same sort of uncomfortable position as I was, right? Because we you know, we're free trade. We want free trade. We defend that. But we also have to acknowledge that we have no free trade relationship with China. And that if the goal is free trade, then it's going to be a rocky path to get there.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the most interesting things, especially as an observer of media and really a lifelong student of it, is how all in the media seems to be to cover up any of the sins of China, if you will.
Yeah.
And yet it seems that the groups of people, and especially the media, who would be the very first victims of a China-imposed governance of the U.S., right?
They already are. They're censoring their own movies. They're censoring their basketball games. I mean, they already are, and
but they're also the most vehement defenders of that sort of China. Why is that?
Because they hate Trump so much. I mean, it's just that they know full well how much blame should be laid on China for the coronavirus pandemic. They know that. But they're so obsessed with pinning every single fault on the president that they can't hold both ideas in their head. They can't even say, well, maybe it's a mix of both. They can't even do that. It's just full on everything is the president's fault because the hatred runs that deep, I think.
That's so true. I mean, Dan nails it. Think for a moment also about Speaker Pelosi, who for decades, she's served for decades in Congress, and for decades, she was one of the leading China hawks on Capitol Hill. Yet that changed the day that President Trump became president, because once Donald Trump held the mantle as the only president to be tough on China in our lifetimes, that created a divide where she couldn't afford politically to appear that she was on the same side as a sitting president who she despises, or the base of her party would eat her alive for doing it. And that's the sad reality. I have a number of friends on the other side of the aisle who for years, when I first got here, I partnered with on pieces of legislation to counter the China threat, who have been intimidated by the leadership of their party to no longer go down that path.
Yeah.
You've seen that play out over and over again, all because you have one party that despises the president so much that they can't appear to be on the same page as them.
This gets to a philosophical point that I like to make, is that the problem with the Democrat Party, leftism in general, is that it is not founded in limiting principles. That's a huge problem. See, as a conservative, we can take any new problem and we can place that against a series of principles, a series of questions that we might ask. Does this give you more freedom or less freedom? And if less freedom, why? What is the point? Is this infringing on your rights in order to give somebody else a service? Is this infringing on states' rights? Does this add to our debt? Is this fiscally responsible? There's a series of questions. There's limiting principles that go into place. You don't have that when you're on the left. For them, it's all about end result utopia. And when that's the end, when that's the goal, it doesn't matter how you get there. And that's kind of a dangerous thing. And that leads to things like this, where their policies can change on a dime if that means they gain more political power. And so how do you even know who to trust on the left? It's also why I watch my moderate liberal friends in the Democratic Party be swept up into what is a very radical agenda that has been passed out of the House. And by the way, America's never had to deal with that agenda because none of it ever became law. And we need to do a better job telling people what they passed in the House, because it's a very radical agenda. And you have to wonder how moderate Democrats voted for it when they, and you know why? Because they all told their voters, I just want to go up there and do nice things. I want to be pragmatic. Mm-hmm. Well, when the far left tells them, this is the nice stuff, these are the nice things, trust us. Well, you're wearing the blue jersey, so that's what they vote for. Mm-hmm. There's no limiting principles, and that's a very scary thing.
Let me give you another example of contradiction. I mean, how often do we hear the media howl about President Trump being against the freedom of the press and attacking the media, First Amendment principles? For the last year, I've been complaining that every single morning on my front door in the Longworth House office building, I receive a stack of newspapers, often overwhelming, from the Washington Post, the Washington Times, magazines like Time Magazine, a number of other media outlets as well. They'll be in that stack. Also in that stack is the China Daily newspaper, which is owned and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. They use it as a propaganda arm, and they distribute it around the world. They also happen to put it on the doorsteps mysteriously, on Dan and I's doorsteps every morning. Many of my more naive colleagues might pick that up and read it, or they might do what a lot of us do, leave it on a coffee table where constituents might read it. That gives that newspaper a lot more credibility than what it deserves. I've reached out to everyone from Speaker Pelosi to the Sergeant at Arms of the Congress to ask them, how does this newspaper, which is not an independent newspaper that is actually a state-owned propaganda piece, filled with anti-American stories, that almost every day there's something written in that newspaper that is anti-America. How does that appear on my doorstep? I've sent out press releases about it, and not a single mainstream media outlet has ever covered that story. When that is an attack on our freedom of the press. That is an attack on our on our First Amendment principles right before our eyes. If that can happen on the doorsteps of lawmakers' offices in Washington, D.C., locked congressional House office buildings, it can happen anywhere.
That's amazing. That's amazing. To what degree do you feel like there are viable answers in terms of bills? You've mentioned several of the bills that you have, viable answers that have the support that this audience can be helpful with, that are out there, that we can promote, that we can support you with. I like takeaway from forums like this. I don't want to just scare people and say, we know we have a very looming enemy and that there's a lot of work to be done, but how can we support what you're doing? I think that that's a really important takeaway for this.
So I mentioned one bill that I had, obviously, that basically lets you sue China. I think people can understand that one pretty relatively easy. And how much that manifests into reality, it's unclear. I think greater support for our allies, and that can manifest into legislation too. But it needs to be a combination of Congress and the executive. A higher support for Taiwan, higher recognition of Taiwan, better resources for our Navy and our Special Operations Forces in the Pacific, with an eye on a great power competition, and that's a different set of tactics and equipment than our past wars in the Middle East. Okay, so that takes a realignment as well, and that needs to be inherent in the NDAAs that we pass. And by the way, it is. Like I don't think we would have any complaints about that in the last NDAA. Space Force is actually, I think, an important role in this. That's going to be a big frontier where it will be up to America to lead the way to protect the avenues of space and sort of engage in a fleet mentality, which is why I had an amendment that makes the Space Force use Navy ranks, which I think a lot of people are going to be a fan of. And so those are a couple of things. I know Jim works on a lot as well.
Let me begin with that. As a member of the House Armed Services Committee, we need to begin breaking down barriers at the Pentagon that prevent the type of innovation that we need with our warfighting resources to combat the rise of technology and innovation on the part of the Chinese. I mean, what we know that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, with the PLA, what we know that they're up to, that we're not up to, and somewhat for important reasons, but they're building platforms of information through stealing our facial recognition to biometrics. I mean, I'm astonished at what I've learned about the 23andMe and Ancestry.com. All those kits go to China, so they take that and store it along with facial recognition from apps like the Face app and TikTok. I mean, all of these are tools that they use, that they've been able to spread around the United States to collect information that they can use for their own security purposes. So we have to be mindful of that, and we need to begin a process or accelerate a process in the United States that will rely more upon what we see coming out of Silicon Valley to build up a modern and future military that can prepare for the China threat down the road. So that's one area. Economically, I have a number of bills. One that comes to mind that's more relevant recently is stopping predatory acquisitions by the Chinese of U.S. companies and technologies. What we found is that in another way, they're profiting off of a pandemic of their own making. They're coming in and purchasing companies that have national security related IP. They purchase it while our economy is on its knees, and they take the IP back to China for their own purposes. So sort of building up the government enforcement mechanisms that we have in the U.S. to stop acquisitions by the Chinese like that. We also know they purchased a radio station in Las Vegas at the same time. They did it again to spread propaganda. And I think you're going to see more of that, just as I've already talked about the China Daily, using American media outlets to spread their own propaganda to try to break away and crack through
board positions on existing media outlets also, I think, is a really important one. We're seeing more and more of that. I was not aware of the Ancestry.com and the DNA. What are the two that you mentioned?
23andMe and Ancestry.com.
They have the records of those. So if we put our records out there, they have that.
Which is why the Pentagon has issued an order preventing our military personnel from using those biometric kits. So you should ask yourself, if the Pentagon is telling our troops not to use them, maybe we shouldn't do it either.
And most of us know anyway about TikTok. Do you allow your children to be on TikTok? Because that's a fight in my household, I have to tell you.
I've had to delete it a few times.
Yeah. We need an American TikTok fast.
We need an
Otherwise,
American
we're going to have like a revolt
fast
amongst teenagers.
I agree with you. I agree with you on that. To what degree, gentlemen, the chaos we're seeing in our streets today, you and I know that the Black Lives Matter movement is not at all about saving Black lives, that it's a Marxist front group. Its stated mission is really to destroy the Western family unit, right? And it really reads like a Marxist manifesto. To what degree is the CCP involved in the Black Lives Matter, and to what degree does the more than $1 billion that Black Lives Matter has raised over the last couple of months go to advance communism in the United States?
I'm not aware of direct links, so maybe there are. But I'll go back to a comment I made before. We can't combat the China threat. We can't win the new Cold War if we've sown so much discord in this new civil war that we're going through in society in the United States today. And there's no doubt that both Russia and China are both sitting back and laughing with glee at what they're watching occur in the United States of America today, because it fits right into their agenda. And largely, as China is so culpable for what we're going through, largely this fits right into their vision of what they want to see happen in America. We can't allow them to win that way. We need to unify. We need to unify behind a vision of what we want America to be and how we protect America for the century to come.
Yeah, I don't know of any involvement by the CCP. I will just say that the genius of the left is its ability to take a uncontroversial injustice that maybe we all want to solve and then use that as a vehicle for hyper-radical policy. Mm-hmm. They do it with environmentalism. They do it with labor laws. They do it with everything, and they're doing it with BLM too. The Chinese and the Russians, they don't have to create this. They don't have to create some big conspiracy. We do it to ourselves. All they have to do is come in after the fact and stoke the divides. I think oftentimes they're very surprised by how easy it is. And like you hear this from, I'll never forget this interview. I think it was in 1984 with an ex-KGB agent talking about the Soviet propaganda machine and how that's like 85% of their intelligence operations efforts, and how surprised they often are by how easy it was for phase one, which they call demoralization, which basically means hate your country and hate your institutions. Again, this isn't new what's happening. This is old Marxist strategy. It's been going on for a long time, and it bubbles up kind of naturally within the human psyche. Marxism, again, it's a very romantic ideal, and so we should never think that we're going to escape it. We always have to educate our kids on the dangers of it, because it's very natural to feel that way, to this sort of tribalistic us versus them identity politics is actually deeply embedded in human nature, and so we constantly have to confront it with better Western Enlightenment values. And we didn't do a good job of that, I think, over the last few decades.
Yeah. Last question, because we're running out of time. But if there were one book that you could recommend besides your own, which we're going to get to that, Congressman has a new book out. But if there were one book that you could recommend for people in this time that's just essential reading on this topic, what would it be?
Is Michael Pillsbury's 100-Year War. So that everyone should read it. It was published in 2015. Recently, Michael Auslin published a book, and I'm blanking on the title. Just look up Auslin, Auslin, one of the greatest writers of our time on this subject, and you can find that easily by Googling Michael Auslin.
All right, we'll do that. And Congressman Crenshaw, I wanted to give you just a moment to talk about your new book. Very exciting. I meant to bring it out on stage with me, and I completely missed that. But tell us all about it.
It's called Fortitude, American Resilience in the Era of Outrage. It's about how to be mentally tough and overcome cancel culture and outrage culture. It's about how to think better, how to be better, how to be stronger in your daily life. It's actually pretty light on politics. But it does get into especially the last chapter. It's unfortunately it was very prescient into what we're dealing with right now, with the sort of tearing down of American institutions and tearing down of America herself. That stems from a victimhood ideology and identity politics that is deeply rooted in Marxism. And there's a history for it, and we have to know the history if we're ever going to combat it.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for your time. Appreciate both of you very much, and appreciate you all tuning in as well. I'm Dr. Gina Loudon with America's Voice. Happy to be here at the Freedom Summit, and stay tuned because so many more great panels coming at you. Thanks.
Welcome back to America's Voice and our coverage of the Falkirk Center's Freedom Summit today, coming at you live from the Trump International Hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. I'm Raheem Gassam. You might know me from such shows as War Room Pandemic, and you might also know my guest here in this studio with us today. Natalie Winters is one of our senior reporters over at the nationalpulse.com. Natalie, you've broken so many stories about the Chinese Communist Party and so many of the things we've been hearing at this conference today about the Chinese Communist Party, its influence across American institutions. I want to break this down for people into specifics as well, because frankly, I think a lot of people hear Chinese Communist Party and they know, yes, we're against communism. We don't like the foreign adversaries who are messing around in our country and messing around in our politics. but they don't know how it impacts their day-to-day lives. Now, there's a great wide audience out there that listens to War Room and goes to the National Pulse. But for those that don't know, you started off before we were rudely interrupted by the Congressman and Dr. Junior on stage. You started off telling us a few specific things about the Chinese Communist Party and its influence here in the US. Let's roll through some of those. Why don't you take us away?
Sure. Well, American classrooms, even at the 4th grade level, public schools, so this is happening at taxpayer expense, have aired Chinese state military parades and even coerced students, like I said, as young as 4th graders, to participate in a pen pal program with President Xi Jinping with no furor from the American media, which you would expect had it been Vladimir Putin or Russia.
Hold on, stop right there.
Yes.
You're telling me that American students in American schools are writing pen pal letters with the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party.
And the subject of these letters are Xi Jinping himself imploring American students to become, quote, ambassadors for Sino-American friendship. So it's not just a language and culture initiative, and it was part of a Confucius Institute program, which these institutes like to present themselves as places where kids can learn the Chinese language.
What is the Confucius Institute?
Sure, they're bankrolled and completely funded by the Chinese Communist Party, specifically an entity which was formerly known as Hanban, although they're currently in a rebranding mission. Although it's still state-run, state-administered, it's really just a name change. There's no substantive addendum being made. But, like I said, you see state military parades being aired in classrooms, pen pal programs, and even these teachers who, again, come from China. And if you look at the requirements for teachers who participate in this program, the singular most important thing is, quote, love for the motherland. And the kind of textbooks that they're pushing these teachers to use are written by agencies of the Chinese Communist Party that have been identified by our own government as seeking to mobilize CCP advocates.
Now, where can people find out more about this? Where can they follow you? Because you're breaking the news about what's going on in classrooms, in woke corporations, all day, every day. Every day it seems like you have a new scoop on this stuff. So where can people follow you?
Well, an expose a day keeps the Chinese Communist Party away. That's my motto. So you can find me at Natalie G. Winters on Twitter and, like you said, at the National Pulse.
That's thenationalpulse.com. And we're very grateful for America's Voice in the audience out there who push these things out there and make more people realize. We get a lot of support and a lot of visitors over at the National Pulse who are sharing these stories, including and not limited to the President of the United States himself, who has recently put our stories on his Facebook page, because quite frankly, we have been sleepwalking into a totalitarian-run, state-run Chinese Communist Party trap for the last couple of decades, and we're intent on bringing you all the stories, all the sourcing behind those stories, so you can make up your minds for yourselves. We're now going to go to a quick break here on America's Voice. We'll be back with Dr. Junior Loudon in just a second.
Welcome back to Freedom Summit 2020.
And welcome back. You just saw my panel, of course, with Congressman Dan Crenshaw and Congressman Jim Banks. And I have with me right now Congressman Jim Banks, of course, hailing from the great heartland, Indiana. And I love Midwesterners because, of course, I'm a little biased being from Missouri. Congressman, I wanted to ask you, because a lot of, we got to talk a lot about China, but I wanted to shift because a lot of the folks I know out there are hurting so bad over this COVID thing. And people are wondering about all the different aid packages that are available. I know a lot of business people in particular are hurting. You walk down the streets here in Washington, D.C., and nothing is open. I mean, literally, there are 10 restaurants to choose from if you want to go out to dinner. And even then, you can only sit 6 in a booth, which makes you wonder how they're even making it. Talk to us about what's happening on that front.
Well, we have a debate, as expected, between Republicans and Democrats, but what we do next. I mean, right now, we've passed $3.5 trillion worth of aid packages already, from the CARES Act to other stimulus packages. That we've done a lot, and many of us believe that we need to let what we've done work. At the same time, so many people continue to suffer. Unemployment is still an issue. People are afraid. I mean, at the end of the day, what I hear most of all from my constituents is, how can we get America back on its feet? How can we get our schools reopened? How can we get businesses reopened? Get people moving back in the right direction? Then they see the images of what's going on in Portland and big cities, riots, violence around the country, and they wonder, how can we bring law and order back to the streets? So while Republicans and Democrats are fighting over details of massive spending deals in Washington, I think where most people are is just wondering, how can we bring some stability back to America? And that, hopefully, we can get back to that debate at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have friends who said, we're not going to take part in that because we're not that kind of people. We don't take part in, a lot of, especially my conservative friends, they're rugged, they're not going to take part even though they're hurting. But I have a lot of friends who own businesses, and they said, we can't bring our employees back if we want to because our employees are making more staying home on unemployment than, in some cases, double what they would make if they returned to work. What do we do about that? Because we want to help the people that are sincerely hurting, but how do you decipher? This is a lot of accounting.
So that's one of the areas of disagreement. The continuing the $600 unemployment insurance benefit weekly for those who are unemployed, and whether or not we continue that or prevent it from moving forward. So that's a key central topic between the Republican solutions and the Democrat solutions. Also, how can we provide liability protections to businesses, to institutions that reopen, even to our schools? That's something Republicans have been fighting for, to ensure that those who are trying to do the right thing aren't getting hit with frivolous lawsuits, even after they do everything right and then have a frivolous lawsuit fall in their lap as they reopen. So Mitch McConnell, I appreciate, has made that one of his demands, that any package that moves forward has to provide liability protections for businesses and schools that reopen. And then on top of that, you've heard President Trump fight for a payroll tax cut. And I believe this is fundamentally the most important thing that we could do to stimulate the economy in America, to allow businesses and people to keep more of their hard-earned money through a payroll tax cut. Unfortunately, you've heard a lot of Republicans back off of that demand. It would be my strong sense that Republicans should keep fighting for it, join President Trump in fighting for it, because it could be the most important thing that we do to get the economy moving again.
And what would that look like for the average business owner in real terms?
Well, I mean, it would obviously scale from small employers to big employers. I mean, who are all suffering at this point. I mean, it's not, small businesses make up the bulk of our economy. Where I come from, over 90% of businesses in my district are 500 employees or less, and most of them much less. So a payroll tax cut might not be as large on a scale for those businesses, but across the board, it would provide tax relief to millions of Americans and businesses that would allow them to grow, get open again, and start doing what they do to get the economy growing. I mean, overall, you're going to hear Democrats talk about spending money and sort of the failed economic experiments of the past versus what Republicans have done in the last 3 years. I mean, we've got to give President Trump and Republicans in the House and Senate credit for what we did a couple of years ago with the historic tax cuts, which we saw before our very eyes build this economy into the greatest economy of my lifetime before the coronavirus. So we know tax cuts work.
Right.
We should go back to those formulas that we know that work rather than spending more money. I have 3 daughters who are 10, 9, and 7 years old, and their generation are going. They're the ones that are going to hold the bag for this enormous national debt that we already had, that we just added another $3.5 trillion to. And if the Democrats get their way, we're going to add many more trillions of dollars to it, ending the year closer to 30 trillion when we started the year with 22 to 23 trillion. That's not acceptable to me. I mean, I understand we've got to do more to help those in need, but we can't do it on the backs of the future generation that's going to prevent them from ever achieving the American dream that former generations have been so lucky to have in this country.
And what about stimulation for these people that have just given up? They've gone out of business. What do we do with them? What do we do about that? You know, to get them to go back into business or to do something, because we've got to regenerate so many businesses. I've heard figures all the way up to like 70% in some cases.
Yeah, it's devastating. I hear stories from business owners in my district who are talking about how great things were just a year ago, and now they're talking to bankruptcy lawyers because they've gone out of business, and most of them are service-related businesses. So I don't have a silver bullet answer to that. But what I can say is that what I truly believe is that when we rebuild this economy, and by the way, I don't believe there's anyone better on earth to oversee the rebuilding of the American economy than Donald Trump, because he did it before, and I believe strongly he's going to do it again if we give him a chance to do it for another term. If he gets that chance, you're going to see a transformation of the economy in a lot of ways that can be healthy. I mean, you have people doing things remotely or from home that used to do them in an office or by traveling person to person. Well, that in some ways that creates opportunities maybe in the shared economy. We need to be innovative in our approach by rolling back regulations on new businesses to allow them to start up and grow rather than placing new regulations and higher taxes on them that prevent them ever from going anywhere.
100 days until the election. If President Trump is not reelected, does America survive?
America will always survive. I mean, we're the greatest country in the history of the world. So I'm hopeful and optimistic as ever, but it's going to be hard. I mean, the choice between the two candidates that we have, we just finished up on a panel talking about China, the greatest existential threat that America faces today. And it's a paradigm between a president for the first time in my lifetime who's been tough on China through enforcing and negotiating better trade deals to put the American worker first, the American farmer first, to put Americans first, versus the failed policies of the Obama administration, even Republican administrations before, that have been too cozy, that have played into this fantasy that if we cozy up and turn a blind eye to China's bad actions, then somehow they'll rise up as a democratic nation and join America in America's interest. We know today that that's absolutely a false premise, and we should turn away from that. However, you got a choice on the ballot that's very clear between President Trump, who's been tough on China, and Joe Biden, who as senator and vice president was very much a part of the era in American politics who largely turned a blind eye to China's actions.
Absolutely. What's the one thing that you think that voters should be the most aware of as they're trying to put the pieces back together from COVID, and just looking forward as we go into fall, where we're going to have flus, we're going to have and I have a feeling that we're going to start hearing things again about maybe a new something coming at us, and they're going to want more shutdowns, and so how do you get the message out to people that maybe, I don't know, was the shutdown necessary? Is a new shutdown necessary? What's this going to look like? Because fall is right around the corner.
Yeah, let me begin by saying I'm not at all skeptical about the coronavirus. It is real. It's serious. I'm very skeptical about the American response to it. And what we're seeing with closing down our schools is going to hold back a generation of kids for the first time in American history that aren't going to receive as good of an education as the generation before them. We made decisions that I believe in hindsight will prove to be poor decisions. And I think closing the schools will be the chief among them. If we don't reopen schools here in the fall, in the coming weeks, we're not putting our kids first. And that's what I'm most concerned about today.
Yeah.
The president is fighting for our schools to be reopened. I'm fighting for it too. There should be repercussions for those schools that don't reopen, as American taxpayers have a contract with our schools to provide a good education in the classroom where our kids belong. That's what is at stake. So we need to be realistic about the numbers. We need to tell the truth about the coronavirus and where we stand today. We've seen an incredible decline in the number of deaths due to the coronavirus, but we might see more people test positive. What we've seen in the diminishment of the number of deaths is something we should celebrate. It should absolutely spur us to reopening America.
All right. Congressman Jim Banks from Indiana, thank you so much
Great to be with you.
for being with us today. We're going back to the National Security Panel, which is already in progress. We throw to them.
Wants to write a paper. He's fresh out of the Air Force. The grant's turned down. He gets a phone call. He tells the story in the first few pages. The think tank president says, sorry, we can't fund your projects. Then General Spaulding says he looks at the list of members of the board. Correct me if I'm wrong. Billionaires, various people who've made money from China. Well, this is an enormous problem. If we're in some sense influenced deeply about capital for China, how are we going to undo that? It's going to take legislation, which leads to my second point about what we do next and where China's growth came from. Technology, restricting U.S. capital, restricting U.S. investments in China, takes legislation. I've counted more than 80 examples, Bill, 80 current examples of bills introduced by congressmen or senators to impose costs on China, including being able to sue China legally for damages for the China virus. Generally speaking, all of this legislation attracts 4 or 6 co-sponsors. I was a Senate staffer for 10 years. I know how to count. I know when senators cared about something, they would tell us staff, go find me co-sponsors. When I introduce this bill, I want 50 co-sponsors. And if you want to raise next year, Dr. Pillsbury, I want 60 co-sponsors for my legislation. These 80 bills are being introduced, sometimes with 0 co-sponsors, other than one who drafted it, and they're going nowhere. There are no hearings. The leadership doesn't put them up for a vote. So we're in deep trouble. The senators and congressmen come on television. They especially come on Fox News. They see an audience of 4 million people. The host, more and more, the hosts are saying, Senator, how's your bill doing? How many co-sponsors have you got? That's extremely constructive. That people don't get away with just what sometimes is called virtue signaling. I don't like China. I want to stop them somehow. Here's my bill. That's it. Wash my hands, work on something else. That's another thing the Chinese are laughing at us. I was last in China in August. Lots of people I meet with in China have PhDs from American universities and now advise the Chinese government, or they're in it. Xi Jinping's daughter, Harvard graduate. Yang Jiechi's daughter, Yale graduate. They understand our system extremely well. My last point really would be, how are American influence operations inside China? Do our ambassadors to China always speak Mandarin fluently? Basically, it's never happened. There's 2 who are somewhat good, but I wouldn't call them television show fluent. Neither would they. How about our programs inside China? They're blocked. They're jammed. How about our magazine that used to be passed out by USIA? No more USIA, no more magazine. So if we made a list of here's what China does for influence operations inside the United States, and then we said, gee, I'd like to do that inside China, it would be very, very difficult. Not to mention, and by the way, some senators have proposed this. What happened to the legislation? Just like I said, it's dead, goes nowhere, stays alive on Fox News. Oh, I've got a plan, and then nothing happens. So I haven't had time to promote my own book, 100-Year Marathon, but basically it's a history. It's a history based on declassified documents of how we got here, how naive and delusional American presidents and American policymakers, including myself, got here. And the book has now sold more than 200,000 copies. It's been translated into 8 languages, all of China's neighbors. It's a bestseller. So this is my challenge for General Spalding. I read in a tweet his book has sold 33,000 copies. So I'm 6 times more, but that doesn't mean the quality of my book is higher. Maybe his book is better. Not to mention our moderator Bill's book, Deceiving the Sky. I don't know the sales figures, but I hate to be delivering bad news, but it seems to me we're in for a long kind of Cold War with China. This is just the early phases, and so far, President Trump has turned things around. It's possible he's got the successful formula, but we're a long way to go before China becomes the kind of China that we all thought would happen before. How's that for an opening statement, Bill?
Excellent, excellent, well said. And I would point out that you mentioned legislation. All of the best things that have been done regarding China have been in legislations, because policies can be changed from administration to administration. But if you look at the record, first of all, there's the Taiwan Relations Act, which was passed basically after the U.S. recognized Beijing diplomatically. Then there's also the Tiananmen sanctions, which remain in place. Also the annual military power report that the Pentagon has to done. So it's really important to codify these things, and I think we're beginning to see that with the Trump administration. Let's turn now to General Spalding and for your remarks.
Thank you, Bill. Well, so it's an interesting thing that Michael Pillsbury talks about. You know, his book was the first one I read when I got to the Pentagon in 2014. And what I would tell people is that just go read the concluding chapter, and you really get an understanding of, you know, a synopsis of what he was trying to say. And essentially, it was that we had bent over backwards to help the Chinese Communist Party grow into the power that it currently is. Of course, when I got to the Pentagon in 2014, I was very much, you know, what I would say a panda hugger. And in fact, Michael Pillsbury taught me how to be what he would now say is a super hawk. But I don't feel myself to be hawkish. I really focus on defending the American people, the American way of life, our Constitution. And in fact, what you look at in the current national security strategy, in addition to being clear, concise, and comprehensive, it is about how we turn things around. And while it's been noted and lauded, it hasn't been widely understood. And so my book, Stealth War, is really about the background and context behind the national security strategy and what the Trump administration is attempting to do. If you want to know about how successful the president's foreign policy has been, I would refer you to the UK decision to reverse its decision with regard to allowing Huawei to build its 5G network. Now, the media would have you believe that that decision was made overnight, or maybe over a couple of months during this year as a result of the coronavirus, but in fact, it really demonstrates the power of the diplomatic effort undertaken by the Department of State and the National Security Council beginning in the first quarter of 2018 after the National Security Strategy was released. That diplomatic effort is something that we described in the National Security Council in 2017 as forging a new consensus. And really, before you can address any problem or have a plan or have a strategy, you really need to understand the problem. And so the main problem we were addressing was the inability of the United States to get its interests promoted within international institutions, and this lack of geopolitical power in those institutions. And the primary reason was because most of the nations in those institutions were beginning to look to China and China's model, its economic and political and social model, as more beneficial to its furthering their own interests than being aligned with the American view of the world about democracy, human rights, civil liberties, rule of law, and free trade. And in fact, at the United States needed to forge a new consensus, similar to the Western consensus that sought to really bring democracies together again in a very tight relationship, economically, financially, through trade and information, to match its already strong military alliances. And so that decision by the UK is emblematic of how successful that initiative and diplomacy has been. But we've also gotten a glimpse of China's response to that diplomatic initiative through the coronavirus and the aftermath. With regard to the coronavirus, many people talk about what is the origin of the virus. And I say, disregard that. Really, we're not going to know, because we're not going to be able to get investigators into China, into the lab, to talk to the researchers that were working there, to understand the line of effort of the research, to understand what happened. Was there even any relation between the lab and the coronavirus? That's not something we're going to know. But what we can know with certainty is that the Chinese Communist Party presided over the spread of the virus. And it wasn't that they accidentally presided over the spread of the virus, or it was a manifestation or a secondary effect of its institution. It was that they directly spread the virus. On January 7th, Xi Jinping himself says he's in charge of Wuhan crisis. On the 13th of January, there's media reports about human-to-human transmission that come out in China. And in fact, on the 14th of January, the World Health Organization tweets about limited human-to-human transmission. What was going on during this critical time between the 7th of January, when Xi Jinping was in charge of the crisis in Wuhan, and 23 January, when they shut down Wuhan? What was happening is that not only was the Chinese Communist Party putting pressure on the World Health Organization not to discuss human-to-human transmission, it was also locking down the spread of that information within China. And in fact, at the same time, they were locking down PPE and masks in China and locking down PPE and masks outside of China through their proxies. So over the course of a couple weeks, they began to turn into a net importer of PPE and masks, where they had previously been a net exporter of PPE and masks. At the same time, they shut down domestic travel from Wuhan, but allowed international travel to go forth. Now, so this essentially had the net effect of putting them into the lead position with regard to the spread of the pandemic. They knew that it was going to impact the Chinese society. What they wanted to make sure is that it impacted other societies as well, and that they had the means to really profit from it and to have advantage from it. And so what we're seeing today, and Michael Pillsbury talks about it, is the beginning of the Second Cold War. And really, the pandemic spread by the Chinese Communist Party is opening shots of the Second Cold War. Interestingly, not only do they, uncork this spreading pandemic, but they also uncork a new form of diplomatic and informational war. And so if you go back to, and Michael Pillsbury, who's a very good historian, can talk to you all about how the Chinese Communist Party overthrew the Nationalist Party. But me as a strategist and as a war fighter can tell you that the way that the Chinese think about war, the way that Mao really imbued within the Chinese Communist Party the thinking about war, is that as opposed to the way that we look at it, in specifically between the idea of peacetime and wartime, and that war is politics by other means. In other words, you use warfare to get to a political outcome. And in fact, the Chinese Communist Party thinks the opposite way, that politics is war by other means. In other words, the entire war is about the political war. And that in fact, the coronavirus is the beginning of a political offensive against the free world. How does it manifest itself in the diplomatic and informational components? In the diplomatic effort, they begin to have this, what they call wolf warrior diplomacy. And they begin to spread the idea that this coronavirus didn't manifest itself in China, but in fact it was spread by the United States. The latest thing that they've said is it's been spread by Spain. On the informational effort, 40% of the social media posts with regard to the coronavirus turn out to be bots. So this is state-centered activity influencing our social media, and in fact you see the same kind of activity follow the riots and looting that come on the tail of the coronavirus. And so you're really beginning a glimpse of the manifestation in the 21st century of what two PLA colonels called unrestricted warfare, or in another translation, war without rules. And it is that there is no difference between peacetime and wartime. In fact, we are always at war. And that in fact, there are no rules, and in fact, everything's within the bounds of the conflict. So if you think about that in the context of World War II, the French built the Maginot Line to prevent the Germans from conquering them. And in fact, the Germans went around the Maginot Line and in fact conquered the French. In the case of the United States, we've built this wonderful machine for war: Air Force, Space Force now, Marines, Army, Navy, that really protects us, the physical manifestation of our world, from invasion, when in fact the way that the Chinese Communist Party seeks to wage war is through information and politics. In other words, they are trying to change the character of our society and our political process through the connections of the internet and globalization. And in fact, they've been very, very successful. So this second Cold War is going to be nothing like the first Cold War, and where America's strengths aligned very, very well vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in the first Cold War, our strengths have actually been turned into vulnerabilities in the second Cold War. And in fact, our strengths of openness actually become a vulnerability as the Chinese Communist Party seeks to use innovation, technology, talent, and capital from free societies in a essentially comprehensive battle for hearts and minds of the free world. And they've been very, very successful. Not just billionaires in the United States believe that the Chinese Communist Party has a better system. Many, many diplomats in the EU and the United Nations believe so as well. And in fact, it is the Constitution, as I write in my book, that has essentially given us a shot. Because in the Constitution it says, rather than the leaders of a country having dominion over the population, in fact, the people have dominion in the United States. And in fact, they can elect new leaders that think differently about the problem and bring forth new solutions. And so I think we're going to see what I would call political warfare at a hyperscale going forward. But it's important to note that, here in the United States, it need not become partisan.
And we're going to go now. The president is going to talk about Operation Warp Speed, which we were just talking about actually on this panel. And we'll go to him, I believe, right now.
Thank you very much. Great to be in this wonderful state. So many friends, so much success. And we love being here. And we're here actually today to discuss the exciting progress that we've achieved under the Operation Warp Speed, our historic initiative to develop, test, manufacture, and deliver a vaccine in record time. And that's what it is, in record time. Likewise, therapeutically, we are very, very advanced. You're hearing about it, and you'll be hearing about it a lot more in the next 2 weeks. We will achieve a victory over the virus by unleashing America's scientific genius, which is what it is. I'm therefore proud to announce that this morning, the Moderna vaccine has officially entered phase 3 already, and that's phase 3 clinical trials, the final stage before approval. There's never been anything like this in terms of speed, nothing even close. A second vaccine is likely to enter phase 3 in a matter of days. Under Operation Warp Speed, We've shaved years off of the time that it takes to develop a vaccine, in some cases, many years. And we've done it while maintaining the FDA gold standard for safety. This is the fastest a vaccine for a novel pathogen has ever gone. It's never gone like this. And if you look at where we are by phase 3, we can say ever gone by far. 4 additional promising candidates are expected to enter final trials in the coming weeks, including the Novavax vaccine being developed right here at this facility. It's an incredible facility. We're going to be making a tour in a little while, very complete tour with the folks that run it and the people that operate. We've just completed a tour of Fujifilm's innovation laboratories, and that's going to be done at much higher level in a few minutes after I'm finished, and I believe we'll take a few questions too, which we're carrying out a crucial biomanufacturing process needed to make the Novavax vaccine. This production is made possible by my administration's $1.6 billion award to Novavax as part of Operation Warp Speed. It lets us deliver the final product in a time that never has been achieved anywhere at any time for anything like this. These same manufacturing processes are being conducted on an even larger scale in College Station, Texas. Today, I'm proud to announce that HHS has just signed a $265 million contract with the Fujifilm Texas A&M Innovation Center, which is quite the place, to dramatically expand their vaccine manufacturing capacity. I want to thank Fujifilm CEO Martin Meeson for welcoming us today. And Martin, where is Martin? Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. Really wonderful to be with you under these circumstances, in particular, with all the progress that's being made. As well as Novavax CEO Stanley Erck. Stanley, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks also to Secretary Alex Azar, who's with us. Senator Tom Tillis, thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. Stand up, Tom. Good job you've done. Thank you very much. You really have. Representatives Richard Hudson, David Rouser, Mark Walker, Dan Bishop, and Greg Murphy. Thank you. All friends, all warriors. Lieutenant Governor Dan Forrest, who I hear is doing a great job. Where's Dan? Stand up, Dan. Great job, Dan. Really good. North Carolina House Speaker Tim Moore. Thank you, Tim. Great job. And President Pro Tem of the North Carolina State Senate, Phil Berger. Thank you, Phil, very much. I appreciate it. Operation Warp Speed is funding a historic portfolio of highly promising vaccine candidates. In addition to our $1.6 billion investment in Novavax, we've issued a $483 million contract with Moderna, a $1.2 billion contract with AstraZeneca, a $465 million contract with Janssen, and just last week, a $1.95 billion agreement with Pfizer. Tremendous progress is being made with all of those great companies. A groundbreaking agreement with Pfizer includes a guarantee to deliver 100 million doses shortly after the vaccine's approval, almost immediately, with the option to purchase an additional 500 million thereafter. Not only is Operation Warp Speed accelerating the development of a vaccine, we're also directing a colossal industrial mobilization to ensure its rapid delivery. Nothing's happened like this since the end of World War II. Instead of the usual sequence of vaccine development, testing, and trials, followed by production, our strategy is to conduct these phases simultaneously, so everything goes at one time. We're not waiting and waiting and waiting. It's all going at one time. We have a system that has, I think it's unparalleled, never been done before, but we suspect it's going to work and work very well. We're mass producing all of the most promising vaccine candidates in advance, so that on the day one that it's approved, it'll be available to the American people immediately, and we'll probably have a lot for a lot of other people throughout the world. The world is suffering from this China virus. Another dimension of Operation Warp Speed is our focus on therapeutics to treat the virus. Over 140 clinical trials are underway,
and a number of effective therapies have already been developed and widely delivered, including remdesivir, which is having a tremendous impact. You see that with mortality rates and other things statistically. Dexamethasone, convalescent plasma, and antibody treatments. We have numerous treatments right now that are under study, and I think over the next couple of weeks we may actually have some very positive answers as to that. On July 7th, we announced a $450 million agreement with Regeneron to begin advanced manufacturing of its antibody treatment, which is currently in late-stage clinical trials. Late stage. Due to the medical advances we've already achieved and our increased knowledge on how to treat the virus, the mortality rate for patients over the age of 18 is 85% lower than it was in April. Think of that, 85%. And is 25% lower than Europe as a whole. In the middle of April, more than 22% of all deaths in the United States were attributable to the China virus. As the last week, that number has dropped down. As of last week, it's dropped down to under 7%. To decrease the turnaround times for testing, the first two laboratories have been approved to provide pooled testing. Very important. In other words, samples from multiple patients are processed together. They're pooled. Now, pool testing will reduce turnaround times by substantially more than 50%. Last week, our Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services began distributing rapid point-of-care diagnostic test instruments to all of the nursing homes in the United States, focusing on the areas of greatest need, which is our elderly and our nursing homes. What we've already sent includes testing instruments to 635 nursing homes for 196,000 rapid point-of-care tests. It's a tremendous amount. You'll get your response and answer from 5 to 15 minutes. Over the next 3 weeks, 1,700 nursing homes will receive an additional 800,000 point-of-care tests. Think of that. The United States has conducted over 52 million tests. That's more than all of Europe put together times 2. Nobody's even close. And as countries go, it is, as an example, India is up to 11 million tests. We're going to be very shortly at 55 million tests. India has 1.4 billion people. Through our relentless efforts, we've completely rebuilt our stockpile, which the previous administration depleted and did not refill. The cupboards were bare, I say it often. In total, we've now distributed nearly 100 million N95 masks, 35 million surgical masks, 15 million face shields, and much, much more. In addition to that, ventilators, the most difficult thing of all. We are now building thousands a month, and we're distributing. We have all we need in our country, but to other countries that are in desperate need. Other countries are having a tremendously difficult time with the virus. Last week, FEMA sent additional personnel, protective equipment to over 15,000 nursing homes, including 643,000 pairs of protective eyewear, 7 million masks, 34 million pairs of gloves, and 6 million gowns. It's a lot. Over the weekend, cases in Florida, Texas, and Arizona held steady and are now heading down. In Arizona, they're heading very substantially down and rapidly. We've been constant and in constant communication with the states and are surging them resources when requested. They largely had what they needed, but anything they need, we send them immediately. We are totally full. We have everything we need. We get it to the states immediately. We deal with the governors. The relationship with the governors has been very good. These states are not out of the woods, but rigorous compliance with guidelines should allow them to turn the corner and very, very quickly. We are working with every governor and health commissioner across the country to bring a complete individualized analysis to each state, as well as tailored recommendations. States are different. My administration is also closely monitoring the surging caseload in Latin America, which is now the region in the world with the most active reported infections by far. Due to the relative scarcity of testing in Latin America, however, the region's reported number of cases is also likely to be dramatically undercut or undercounted. And I can say that's probably true throughout the entire world. We report our cases. Most of the world doesn't. They either don't do testing, therefore they have very few cases, even though people are sick, or they just don't report. And given the reality of what we just said, we're focusing aggressively on the Texas border and countries that we think have to be watched very, very carefully, because you have some very, very highly infected countries outside of our borders. I've spoken with Governor Abbott, terrific gentleman, and I can report that over 3,300 federal personnel are on the ground in Texas. We've given them a tremendous amount of extra help, including doctors, nurses, frontline people. We've supplied Texas with more than 2.5 million gloves, 800,000 goggles, 337,000 surgical gowns, 1.8 million surgical masks, 1.36 million N95 respirators, and 500,000 KN90 masks. Beginning this week, Texas hospitals will receive 500 cases of remdesivir, which has proven very effective, enough to treat 3,200 patients. In addition to the cross-border spread, this stage of the pandemic is being fueled by younger Americans who generally have little risk of being seriously harmed by the disease, but can spread the disease. We need all Americans to be conscious about their actions and to exercise extreme vigilance. I trust all Americans to do the right thing, but we strongly advise everyone to especially focus on maintaining a social distance, maintaining rigorous hygiene, avoid large gatherings and crowded indoor bars, and wear masks when appropriate.